The night settles over the old road like a slow exhale, softening every shape the moon chooses not to claim. A thin mist lies across the ground, drifting in quiet curls that move as if listening for something. Behind the traveller, the village is already dissolving into distance, its warm windows shrinking to faint embers swallowed one by the dark. Ahead, nothing waits except the trembling yellow glow of a single lantern swinging from the end of a wooden pole. It is too small to challenge the night, yet it moves with the stubborn insistence of someone who believes even the weakest light can hold a little corner of the world together. The pilgrim walks with the slow rhythm of someone conserving strength. His cloak presses close around him, pulled tight against the whisper of cold that rises from the damp earth. The staff in his hand taps gently on stones and roots, a fragile pulse marking his presence on a road that has known many feet before his. Each sound travels only a short distance before being swallowed by the hush of the trees. Their branches arch overhead like silent witnesses, leaning close enough that he can almost feel the weight of their attention. Every few steps he glances to the side, searching the shadows between trunks where moonlight breaks but does not settle. His mind turns over quiet fears, the way tired fingers might turn a bead or charm. Bandits could linger somewhere beyond the mist. Wolves might pace him for a while, waiting. Yet the thoughts that press hardest against his ribs are not shaped like teeth or blades. They come from the sense that unseen eyes are studying him from within the forest, measuring the worth of his resolve. He tightens his grip on the staff and touches the small bundle hidden beneath his cloak. Wrapped in cloth, secured with a loop of cord, the relic rests against his chest like a second heartbeat. It is no bigger than a curled hand, and its weight is barely anything at all, but its presence steadies him. The thought that an object so small might bend the story of his life keeps his feet moving along the dirt path even as the night deepens. Maybe it can soften the harsh shape of a sickness. Maybe it can lift a thread of danger from someone he loves. Maybe fate itself, which feels so solid during daylight, can be persuaded to lean a little in another direction. He does not know whether miracles are real in the way people argue about at market tables, but he knows the power of a hope that refuses to die, even when pressed beneath layers of silence. Tonight that hope glows inside him like the lantern's flame, flickering but persistent, illuminating no more than a few paces at a time, yet guiding him steadily forward. The road stretches ahead in a wavering ribbon, sometimes opening into pools of moonlight, sometimes tightening into narrow passes where branches scrape softly against stone. The air carries the scent of damp leaves and distant smoke, reminders that the world continues beyond his small circle of light. Somewhere far off an owl calls, its voice rising and falling like a question left unanswered for centuries. He listens, letting the sound settle into him, matching its lonely cry to his own quiet thoughts. Though he walks alone, there is a strange comfort in the sense of being followed not by danger, but by something patient and observant. The lantern swings gently, and its glow seems to brush the edges of another presence walking just behind him, silent and curious. If he turned, he would see only the empty road. Yet he feels the gaze of the night itself studying his steps, wondering what promise urges him onward when the world is at its quietest. His breath creates small clouds that cling to the mist before fading. The rhythm of walking becomes a kind of trance. Each footfall merges with the soft rustle of his cloak, weaving a slow, hypnotic music that fills the darkness where thoughts drift without boundaries. The pilgrim imagines the relic in his cloak, like a seed of something sacred, something that remembers a time when the divide between heaven and earth was thinner. Perhaps the memory still lingers within the object, waiting to respond to someone desperate enough to seek it under the cover of night. He thinks of the stories whispered by old travelers, bones that glow faintly when danger nears, fragments of cloth that remain warm through winter nights, small pieces of wood said to have survived fire without blackening. He never believed such tales fully, but he never dismissed them either. Tonight, on this quiet road, the line between belief and doubt feels fragile, a thin thread that shifts under the weight of every step. The trees begin to thin, offering glimpses of the sky where stars flicker like hidden signs. He pauses, lifting his face to the cold light, and breathes in the vastness above him. The lantern's glow falls across his hands as he touches the token at his chest, whispering a short prayer that drifts into the night and disappears among the branches. The words are simple, shaped more by longing than by faith. For a moment the road feels less lonely, as if his whisper reached something waiting beyond sight. But with the prayer spoken, another thought rises. Where did this belief begin? How did the idea take root, that objects, small, silent things, might bend destiny for those who reach them? The question hangs in the cool air, steadying itself like a new lantern waiting to be lifted. The pilgrim lowers his hand, takes a slow breath, and steps forward once more, unaware that his quiet question will lead us down older, wider roads, where countless travellers once carried their fears and hopes toward places said to touch the edge of time. On nights when the world feels thin and the wind carries distant voices, the story widens beyond a single traveller. The quiet road he walks is only one thread in a vast tapestry woven across medieval Europe, where countless pilgrims stepped into uncertainty with the same mixture of fear and trembling hope. From misty valleys to rugged hills, these paths stretched outward in every direction, drawing farmers, widows, soldiers, and wandering monks toward destinations glowing with whispered promises. Each believed that somewhere ahead, the ordinary might turn sacred if they reached the place. Fate awaited them there in the dark. They walked for reasons as varied as the landscapes beneath their feet. Some sought healing for wounds that refused to close, others forgiveness for shadows cast long before their journeys began. A few carried quiet questions they could not voice at home, questions they hoped a holy place might answer without judgment. Though many travelled in groups by daylight, bound by songs and shared provisions, just as many found themselves alone at dusk, where every step felt like a private confession whispered to the turning earth. They trusted the path to hear them when no one else dared to listen. Along these winding routes, shrines emerged like islands of certainty in an unpredictable world. Some stood in bustling towns, guarded by stone walls and burning candles. Others hid in remote clearings where moss covered ancient altars. Travellers spoke of churches that held fragments of saints, relics that seemed to pulse with a quiet memory of miracles. A bone wrapped in linen, a sliver of wood, a single drop of dried blood. Each object carried a story older than the pilgrim touching it, promising that heaven had once pressed close enough to leave traces behind, for those brave enough to journey there. Legends travelled faster than the pilgrims themselves. Every inn along the road offered a new tale, passed from mouth to ear beside smoky hearths. A child cured after touching a saint's veil, a farmer spared when lightning split his fields but left his home untouched, a sailor surviving a storm after binding a relic around his wrist. Stories like these drifted across regions, changing slightly with each retelling. Yet their core remained the same. Somewhere in the world were places where the rules of ordinary life trembled and briefly gave way, opening spaces pilgrims hoped might welcome their most fragile prayers. The more these tales circulated, the more the roads themselves changed. Dusty paths once meant for traders slowly became spiritual arteries, carrying the weight of thousands, seeking something just beyond reason. Villages along these routes adapted to the flow, offering bread, shelter, or guidance in exchange for stories of distant wonders. With every passing year, it seemed less like people chose to walk, and more like the road called to them. Even those who doubted miracles felt the pull, sensing that travel itself might loosen whatever suffering clung most tightly, as though distance offered medicine nothing else could provide then. Among the most powerful beliefs was the idea that relics created small fractures in time. Pilgrims whispered that saints, by suffering in extraordinary ways, had left behind traces where eternity had touched the mortal world. To stand in the presence of such an object was to stand near a door cracked open, even if only by a hair's breadth. People approached these relics with reverence, fear, or yearning, hoping that contact with something timeless might alter the narrow course of their own fragile destinies and offer them a chance to reshape what waited beyond the horizon of tomorrow itself again. Those who travelled did so with little certainty beyond the next bend in the road. Maps were scarce, and stories served as the only guides most possessed. A pilgrim might follow rumours carried on autumn winds or trust a stranger met at a crossroads. In these wanderings, something shifted inside them. The journey became less about reaching a particular shrine and more about the slow unravelling of fears they had hidden for years, fears that surfaced as miles passed beneath aching feet, drawing out truths they had long ignored, inviting them to see their own lives anew once more tonight. Though each pilgrim's reason differed, they shared a sense that the world held hidden seams where power gathered quietly. Some believed these seams were blessings, others warnings. Yet all felt compelled to seek them. The road became a mirror reflecting what they feared losing most. A mother grieving a child might walk hundreds of miles to touch a relic rumoured to mend shattered hearts, while a man haunted by guilt might hope a distant shrine could lift the weight pressing heavily upon his soul. Each believed the journey itself listened, measuring intentions before granting any final mercy on that night. As the narrator's gaze drifts above these many roads, a pattern emerges. Pilgrimage was not a pastime but a language, spoken with footsteps rather than words. Every mile carried an unspoken plea. The land remembered these movements, shaping stories that continued long after the travellers returned home or vanished along forgotten paths. Even the most skeptical villagers could not entirely dismiss the steady stream of those who walked past their doors, convinced that sacred places might bend the outlines of their futures, reminding them that destiny felt softer at the edges than they once dared imagine possible in quiet moments. With this wider tapestry now unfolding, the camera of the mind returns to the solitary figure on the night road. His journey reflects thousands behind him, yet remains deeply his own. The darkness around him carries the echo of every pilgrim who has ever stepped into uncertainty, trusting that movement might summon mercy. As he walks, the lantern trembles slightly, casting long beams that stretch ahead like questions. And with each step, the world seems to lean closer, listening for what he hopes to find, drawing us with him toward that fragile realm where belief and longing quietly meet now. The night changes the roads in ways sunlight never reveals. During the day, pilgrims move like a river of voices, singing, praying, bargaining for space, as they wind toward shrines that glimmer across the continent. But when dusk settles, all that motion dissolves. The same paths that held laughter hours earlier now contract into narrow corridors, where sound behaves differently, stretching or shrinking without warning. A rustle becomes a warning, a whisper becomes a presence, and every footstep feels amplified, as though unseen forces have been waiting patiently for the sun to disappear so they can emerge again into view tonight. Pilgrims who choose to walk at night understand this transformation intimately. They feel the road tightening around them, not with malice, but with a kind of ancient curiosity. Darkness strips away the comfort of crowds and forces them to meet their fears face to face. Some step forward because they seek silence the daytime cannot give. Others walk because their troubles have grown too heavy to wait until morning. Whatever the reason, each night traveller senses that the world becomes more attentive after sunset, as if something out there listens more closely when the stars rise above the quiet road. They also know the night conceals more than wildlife or thieves. It hides the shifting thoughts that rise only when the world grows still. Footsteps begin to mirror the beat of worries held too long. Memories surface, blending with imagined futures, until both feel equally possible. For some pilgrims, this is the true reason they avoid the sun. Daylight is too sharp, too certain, too crowded with expectations. At night, doubt can breathe. At night, hope can whisper. And sometimes, the two twist together, urging a traveller forward with the strange clarity that comes from walking in darkness once more. Some medieval records hint that particular relics answered these nighttime journeys more readily than daytime petitions. Chroniclers wrote of travellers arriving before dawn to find candles flickering without wind, or feeling sudden warmth rise from a reliquary stone-cold hours earlier. Such accounts were rare, but not rare enough to dismiss completely, and they spread quietly among those who listened for unusual details. Over time, stories suggested that relics responded differently depending on the hour. Midnight held one kind of power, twilight another. Pilgrims whispered that timing mattered as much as distance, and that fate listened differently in darkness each night. Why relics were thought to behave this way was never fully explained. Some believed the veil between worlds thinned during certain hours. Others claimed angels descended closest to earth when shadows stretched longest. A few insisted the power came from the human heart itself, which softened during the late hours when defenses weakened. Whatever the cause, these beliefs guided feet more surely than any map. Pilgrims waited for signs that only they could interpret: an uneasy dream, a stirring wind, a sudden certainty, and stepped into the night, trusting that the darkness itself formed part of the ritual they sought to find. Night roads demanded a different kind of courage. A pilgrim moving through moonlit fields accepted that danger grew sharper when shadows stretched long across the path. Yet fear alone was never enough to turn most back. Something deeper urged them forward, something shaped from grief, longing, or a whispered hope they dared not share. They walked as though unseen forces weighed every step, measuring intent. Some travelers reported feeling watched not with malice but expectation, as if the night waited for them to ask the right question. In that silent companionship, the journey became strangely intimate and strangely revealing tonight. Many who chose the night path did so because daylight exposed them to more than mere crowds. Taxes, tolls, and prying eyes made travel complicated, especially for those fleeing debts or enemies. Under darkness, they could slip between villages unnoticed, carrying secrets wrapped tighter than their cloaks. Others walked at night because illness pressed urgently upon them. They feared waiting until morning might steal whatever chance remained. Still, others moved because shame followed them, and the night offered gentler company. Whatever their reasons, they found the darkness both a refuge and a test, shaping the path ahead for their souls. Some chronicles describe pilgrims who reached shrines precisely before sunrise, claiming miracles unfolded at that fragile edge between night and day. A lame boy reportedly stood on his own moments after touching a saint's shroud. A woman long barren conceived after praying beneath a relic's shadow during an eclipse. Though skeptics dismissed such tales, they continued to circulate among those who listened closely. These stories encouraged travelers to time their journeys, not by convenience but by belief. If a relic could bend fate, perhaps the hour mattered as much as the destination, shaping the outcome in ways unseen to them. And so, as our lone pilgrim pauses at a crossroads, where three narrow paths diverge into trees, the night around him feels charged with the weight of these old beliefs. He senses the unseen threads that have guided countless others, threads woven from fear, longing, and the fragile hope that time might shift for those who ask gently. The lantern trembles in his hand as he considers which route feels most alive beneath the darkness. Somewhere ahead lies the relic he seeks, but the hour matters, and something in the cool air urges him to choose carefully before moving forward. The crossroads waits with the quiet patience of old roads that have witnessed thousands of choices. Our traveller inhales slowly, feeling the weight of uncertainty mingle with the strange promise of night. Whispers from distant centuries echo around him, guiding without revealing. As he steps toward the path he believes will lead him closest to fate's thinnest veil, the question rises naturally. How did these roads, shrines, and beliefs spread so widely across the land? That curiosity leads us onward, toward the origins of this vast pilgrimage world, where geography and myth intertwine in ways still unfolding before us now. Europe, when viewed from far above in the deep quiet of night, appears less like a continent, and more like a living body, threaded with ancient veins. These are the pilgrimage roads lines carved into soil by centuries of feet, hopes, fears, and whispered prayers. The camera drifts slowly over this imagined landscape, sliding across mountains, plains, and the dark edges of coastlines. Each faint path below represents a story once carried by someone who believed that walking toward a certain place could change what waited in their life. These roads glow faintly, like memories that never learned how to fade. Some routes are so famous, they rise almost like constellations on this earthly map. The long road to Santiago stretches westward toward the ocean, a ribbon worn by countless souls seeking forgiveness. Paths to Rome spread like spokes toward the seat of the church, while the dream of reaching Jerusalem pulls others across continents and seas. Yet, between these great arteries lie thousands of smaller tracks, a steep hill leading to a lonely chapel, a path curling toward a spring whispered to cure fevers, a trail vanishing into forest shadows toward a shrine known only to locals there. Before these routes were marked on maps or praised in songs, they began as nothing more than simple tracks between villages. Shepherds, traders, hunters, and wanderers pressed them into being without knowing they were shaping the geography of devotion. Over time, stories began clinging to these routes. Someone heard of a miracle near a spring, another dreamed of a saint visiting a certain grove. Gradually, people followed those whispers, and the earth remembered their footsteps. What began as practical paths slowly transformed into spiritual arteries, connecting the ordinary world to something felt but unseen. As pilgrims continued to travel, guidebooks emerged, handwritten leaves bound in cloth, offering warnings about rivers, distances, and safe places to sleep. Monasteries posted signs carved into wood or stone, directing travelers toward holy destinations. Routes became official, stamped with approval, yet beneath this tidy structure pulsed a more mysterious layer. Many people believed these roads were not merely convenient ways to reach churches. They were threads woven into a larger pattern, as though saints in heaven had drawn lines above, and human feet simply traced them below, fulfilling a design older than memory itself tonight. Each destination carried its own promise. A shrine might be known for healing those whose wounds refused to close. Another offered protection in war. Some guarded mothers through childbirth. Others promised forgiveness for heavy, hidden sins. Travelers chose their paths according to the needs pressing on their hearts. A man burdened by guilt might walk toward a shrine, said to ease the troubled soul. A mother, fearing for her sick child, would seek a spring whispered to cure fevers. Every road held a distinct hope, and pilgrims followed them as though drawn by invisible cords. The camera glides over hills, rolling like dark waves beneath the moon. It sweeps across forests, stitched with narrow trails, then dips toward riverbanks where stones gleam faintly in starlight. Across these changing landscapes, the pilgrim roads appear as pale scars, delicate, winding, persistent. They cross borders without hesitation, linking kingdoms that rarely agreed. They cut through wilderness without shrinking back. In this drifting view, Europe appears unified not by armies or politics, but by the quiet determination of countless souls seeking something beyond the reach of ordinary days. Villages along these paths grew accustomed to the rhythm of pilgrims. Some prospered, offering warm beds, bread, or protection from harsh weather. Others remained poor, but proud to stand on roads that carried holy stories. At night, lanterns flickered from doorways as villagers watched travelers pass like moving shadows. During the day, locals pointed out shortcuts, warned of hazards, or simply shared tales of miracles they had heard in childhood. The roads shaped the culture as much as geography, blending fear, belief, and hope into a single current running across the land without end then. To many medieval minds, this network of roads created a mirror of heaven. Every saint above had a shrine below, and the roots tying them together acted like cords binding earth to the divine. It was said that to walk a pilgrimage road was to step along a line already traced in the spiritual realm. A traveller moved not only through countryside, but through a pattern laid down by faith itself. This idea comforted those who feared unpredictability. If the roads were drawn in heaven first, then following them meant stepping into a design not ruled by chance anymore tonight. The more people walked these paths, the more alive they seemed to become. Pilgrims spoke of feeling watched over by unseen presences, of sensing guidance at certain crossroads, or warmth near certain stones. Whether these impressions came from exhaustion, faith, or something stranger mattered less than the experiences themselves. The roads carried stories the way rivers carry silt, each tale adding weight and colour. Over generations, these paths formed a spiritual circuit through which pilgrims flowed like currents, drawn toward shrines glowing with both legend and longing. And as the camera settles once more on this glowing network stitched across the land, a question rises gently. What waited at the ends of these long, uncertain journeys that convinced so many to leave home and follow lines written in both soil and sky? The answer lies ahead, where relics, those small, silent fragments of the sacred wait, like sparks in the dark, promising to bend what seems unchangeable. That question leads us onward, into the next section where the nature and power of relics reveal themselves more fully. Relics, in the quiet world of medieval belief, were not simply objects resting behind glass or guarded by stone walls. They were fragments of stories carried across centuries, pieces of lives that had burned brightly enough to leave an imprint on the world. The narrator drifts toward them gently, describing the way a gilded case might catch candlelight, how silk wrappings whisper against carved wood, how the air itself seems to thicken around a reliquary, as if remembering the heartbeat it once sheltered. Every relic, no matter how small, was approached with a reverence shaped by longing in the dark. Some relics were bones polished by centuries of veneration, their edges smoothed by generations of hopeful fingers. Others were splinters of ancient wood, believed to have come from places where suffering and the divine once met. There were cloths said to carry dried blood, teeth set in crystal, or hair sealed within wax. To the modern viewer, these objects might seem strange, but to medieval pilgrims they were echoes of presence, remnants that held a memory not bound by time. People approached them, believing holiness could linger, settling into matter the way light settles into still water in deep silence. Relics were grouped into categories, though the boundaries were softer than the guidebooks suggested. First came bodily remains, the bones and fragments of saints whose lives had pierced the ordinary world with uncommon fire. Next were objects touched by these holy figures, things that had absorbed their nearness: sandals, staffs, cups, veils. Finally came relics linked directly to Christ or the Virgin, fragments that carried a weight pilgrims scarcely dared to imagine. Each category formed a ladder of proximity, a way of measuring how closely one might stand to moments believed to have reshaped the course of time for them. To stand before a relic was to step into a charged stillness, a hush that blurred the distance between then and now. Pilgrims described feeling warmth radiate from within, gilded cases, or sensing a subtle vibration beneath their fingertips. Others felt nothing physical at all but experienced a shift in thought, as though an unseen presence listened. The relic became a doorway, small yet immense, inviting the traveller to imagine a world in which suffering had meaning and miracles were possible. Even doubt softened in such places, touched by the quiet conviction of countless seekers who had knelt there before. But relics also carried complexities that slipped through the cracks of faith. Sometimes two churches claimed the same saint's skull, each insisting theirs bore the true mark of holiness. In other cases, multiple towns displayed fragments said to be pieces of the same sacred object. Instead of collapsing belief, these contradictions formed strange harmonies within medieval minds. People accepted that holiness might multiply, that divine presence could echo in more than one place at once. What mattered was not forensic certainty, but the possibility that time, touched by the sacred, might refuse to remain fixed within ordinary boundaries for them. Pilgrims rarely questioned these tensions directly. They understood that truth could live in many forms, that faith often stretched wider than reason. Standing before a relic, a traveller felt the weight of longing more strongly than any need for proof. The object before them, whether bone or cloth or wood, carried the promise of nearness to something greater than fear. And so they knelt, whispered, wept, or waited in silence, hoping the relic might tilt the unfolding of their lives. Sometimes nothing happened, sometimes everything did. Either way, the belief itself bound them to the sacred, with quiet certainty always. Relics also shaped how communities understood themselves. A town that guarded a powerful relic became a place of pilgrimage, its name carried across borders by grateful or desperate travelers. Markets grew, inns flourished, and festivals rose in honor of the saint believed to dwell nearby. The relic anchored the community's identity, giving people a sense of protection and purpose. Even those who doubted miracles felt pride in living near something revered. The shrine became a heartbeat for the region, drawing people inward like a steady pulse, whispering that their corner of the world touched the divine in some enduring way. Yet relics remained, above all, deeply personal. A pilgrim might walk hundreds of miles simply to spend a single moment kneeling before a small fragment of bone. To them, this encounter was not symbolic but intimate, a meeting across centuries. The relic was believed to remember the saint, to hold a trace of their compassion or courage. Touching it, or even standing close, felt like leaning against a presence that understood suffering. Pilgrims whispered confessions, offered vows, or begged for healing, trusting the relic to carry their pleas into the unseen, where answers might take shape for those who wait. Even the contradictions surrounding relics, the overlapping claims, the impossible multiplicities did little to weaken devotion. Instead, they revealed something essential about belief. It was not bound to linear logic but to yearning. Pilgrims knew the world was full of ambiguities, yet they walked toward the sacred because it offered a language for their deepest needs. A relic might be one of many, but to the person kneeling before it, that fragment became singular. It held their story, their hope, their fear. In its silent presence, they felt time soften, offering a space where impossible outcomes might draw quietly near to them. And so the narrative returns to a gentle truth. Relics were not powerful because they solved every problem, but because they gave people a place to carry their burdens. The pilgrim approaching such objects felt accompanied, as if the path behind them and the path ahead were being held together by something patient and ancient. These fragments, no matter how small, gathered centuries of human longing and shaped it into quiet hope. And as faith in these relics grew, a darker question emerged. What happens when such power is sought not for solace but for influence? That question waits ahead. The roads of pilgrimage carried prayers, hopes, and fragile promises, but they also carried something much heavier: opportunity. Wherever pilgrims gathered, money gathered too. Offerings clinked into wooden boxes. Merchants sold food, candles, charms, and beds for aching bodies. Inns swelled with travellers seeking warmth, and markets bloomed around shrines like bright halos of trade. It did not take long for towns to understand that relics were more than sacred objects. They were the centres of an economy that pulsed with every footfall. A holy fragment could change a village's fate as surely as a river or fertile field. This did not always begin as greed. Many communities truly believed they were guardians of something sacred, chosen to shelter it with reverence. But belief and survival wove together in complicated ways. A town with a strong relic prospered, one without might fade into obscurity. So when a rival village attracted crowds with tales of miracles, others listened closely. They watched how pilgrims followed rumour as eagerly as scripture. A whisper that a saint's bones healed fevers could divert the flow of visitors, and with them, the lifeblood of a region. Holiness became not only spiritual currency, but literal sustenance. Churches learned to compete quietly at first, then openly. A community might claim its relic was older, more powerful, or closer to the saint's heart. Priests might emphasize one miracle repeatedly until it became known across the countryside. Some towns boasted guidebooks praising their shrine. Others carved symbols into stones along nearby roads, gently nudging travelers toward their altars. Sometimes these efforts were subtle, born from devotion and pride. Other times they were bold, revealing an unspoken truth. The boundary between sacred duty and practical ambition was far thinner than most would admit aloud. Stories began to circulate about relics mysteriously appearing where they were needed most. A drought struck a region, and soon workers digging a foundation uncovered bones wrapped in ancient cloth. A nearby chapel was falling into ruin, and suddenly a shepherd dreamed of a saint directing him to a hidden grave. These discoveries arrived with uncanny timing, solving not only spiritual longing, but economic desperation. Villagers accepted them gratefully, convinced heaven had intervened. Yet outsiders raised eyebrows, wondering whether the divine chose its moments neatly, or whether human hands gently arranged circumstances to match the community's deepest hopes. There were even tales of relic theft, though most accounts softened the word into something gentler. Children grew up hearing legends of holy translations, moments when saints chose to be moved from one place to another. In reality, some towns stole relics under the cover of night, believing the saint would prefer a more prominent home. A group of monks might quietly slip bones into their cloaks, carrying them across fields before the theft was noticed. When the relic arrived at its new shrine, miracles were often reported almost immediately, as if to justify the journey undertaken without permission. The psychology behind these acts is more complex than simple deceit. Medieval people believed saints were active, choosing where their presence was needed. If a relic could be removed, then perhaps the saint desired movement. If a community risked hardship to claim sacred remains, perhaps that devotion proved they deserved them. This mindset blurred the line between theft and divine will. For many, it was unthinkable that a relic could settle somewhere without the saint allowing it. Thus, human actions were interpreted through the lens of heavenly preference, transforming questionable deeds into spiritual narratives that comforted entire regions. Competition for relics sometimes became fierce. Chronicles describe bishops negotiating over saintly fragments as if trading precious metals. Kings offered protection to shrines whose fame benefited their realms. Noble families donated lavish reliquaries, crafted from silver and jewels, hoping to align themselves with the spiritual prestige such objects carried. At times, relics served as political tools, strengthening alliances or calming rebellion. A saint's presence could sanctify a treaty or bless a coronation. Though wrapped in silk and faith, relics held power that moved armies as surely as any fortress or coin. Yet even amid these worldly entanglements, people continued to seek relics with earnest hearts. A pilgrim arriving at a shrine rarely cared whether a relic had been bought, stolen, divided, or disputed. They knelt with sincerity, drawn not by economics but by hope. The miracles recorded true or embellished, offered comfort in a world shaped by uncertainty. A healed wound, a cured illness, a narrow escape, a peaceful death. These were stories that gave structure to fear and meaning to suffering. Pilgrims carried such tales home, where they took root in the imaginations of neighbors and children, reinforcing belief. Communities understood this ripple effect. A relic did not simply attract visitors. It generated stories that traveled far. A miracle whispered in one village might become a legend 2 provinces away. These legends acted like magnets, pulling new travelers along the same paths. The more miraculous a relic seemed, the wider its influence spread, feeding both devotion and commerce. In time, a town's prosperity and spiritual identity intertwined so deeply that removing the relic would have felt like removing the town's own heartbeat. The sacred and the practical fused into a single, intricate dance. Still, beneath the visible swirl of money, prayer, and politics, a quieter truth persisted. Whatever ambitions swirled around relics, individuals sought them for deeply personal reasons. Standing before an ornate reliquary, a pilgrim might feel none of the worldly forces shaping its presence. Instead, they experienced a moment that felt fragile and intimate. The chance to place their grief, fear, or longing into the silence surrounding a sacred fragment. This element of devotion remained untouched by competition or manipulation. It was the heartbeat beneath the noise, the soft center of every pilgrimage. And so, the narrator returns us gently to the night road, where our lone pilgrim walks with steady determination. Whatever ambitions or secrets surrounded relics elsewhere, he carries only belief, distilled and private. His hope is simple, that the object waiting at his journey's end might listen. As he moves deeper into the dark, a new question rises. What does it truly feel like to travel through danger towards something sacred? That question leads us quietly into the next chapter, where the emotional landscape of pilgrimage reveals itself in the shadows. Night changes a road in ways that daylight cannot explain. What looks harmless when the sun is high becomes something older, stranger, and far less forgiving once darkness settles over the land. The narrator leads us into a world where the path narrows, the forest presses close, and every sound seems to come from just beyond the lantern's trembling reach. Trees lean together, as though whispering about the traveller passing beneath them. Branches creak in the wind. Roots twist across the soil like fingers, and the air itself thins until each breath tastes faintly of cold stone and unseen distance. Pilgrims who set out by night understood that they were stepping into danger. Forests were not simply clusters of trees, but deep reservoirs of shadow, filled with places where the moon could not follow. Wolves travelled these same passages, their eyes catching stray flickers of light before disappearing again. A pilgrim never knew whether the rustling in the underbrush came from an animal searching for food, a thief watching from concealment, or a wandering spirit slipping between worlds. Each possibility carried its own flavour of fear, blending into a quiet dread that wrapped tightly around the heart of any traveller. The path itself could vanish without warning. Moorland stretched outward in wide, desolate sweeps where the trail dissolved into darkness, leaving only instinct to guide a pilgrim forward. Marshes swallowed footprints. Bridges groaned under hidden rot, their timbers damp with centuries of rain. One misstep could send a traveller sliding into a ravine or tumbling from a narrow ridge into a river below. Even the most experienced walker felt a prickle of uncertainty with every turn, aware that the night magnified small hazards into looming threats that could undo a life in moments again. Human threats were no less real. Bandits took advantage of moonless nights, waiting in hollows or behind fallen trunks for the sound of approaching footsteps. Outlaw soldiers, men once sworn to kings or lords, sometimes roamed the forests in broken groups, fueled by desperation rather than orders. A pilgrim walking alone carried little more than a staff, a pack of food, and a few coins tucked beneath layers of cloth. Against armed men hardened by hunger or violence, these offered no protection. Stories of robberies and disappearances reached taverns and churches alike, whispered in tones of warning to those planning a journey. Yet the narrator reminds us that medieval fear did not stop with human enemies. People believed the night belonged to more than wolves and desperate men. Spirits were thought to wander beneath the moon, restless dead, or souls unable to find their way into peace. Demons were said to lurk at crossroads, drawn to travellers weighed down by exhaustion. Even the forest itself was imagined as alive with hidden watchers. A snapping twig might belong to an animal, or to something formless that followed silently for miles. Darkness encouraged the mind to fill gaps with imagination, blurring the line between threat and superstition. For the pilgrim, the body became an instrument tuned to every sensation. The weight of the pack pressed into aching shoulders. Feet burned with each step, raw from stones and uneven ground. Breath turned sharp in the cold, rising in pale clouds that drifted backward toward the unseen. Lantern light formed a trembling bubble that moved through the dark, too small to offer safety, too precious to let extinguish. Even the quiet rhythm of walking brought its own tension. Each step felt like a question posed to the night. Will I be allowed to continue? The journey's difficulty deepened its meaning. A path free of danger would have felt ordinary, unworthy of divine attention. But a road filled with shadows, stumbling hazards, and hidden threats made each survivor feel chosen. If it were easy, the pilgrim thought, heaven might not listen. The harder the journey, the more convinced the traveller became that their suffering might count for something beyond itself. Every distant howl, every careless crack of a twig, every uncertain step on a narrow ledge pressed the pilgrim closer toward the belief that the road was testing, shaping, or measuring them somehow. The narrator lingers on the psychological landscape of the night road. Fear was constant, but strangely clarifying. With each passing hour, distractions fell away. The pilgrim became aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every trembling movement of the lantern. Thoughts that felt scattered in daylight formed slow, deliberate shapes in darkness. Worries, once blurred by daily noise, sharpened into single points of longing. The pilgrim wondered whether the dangers of the night existed, not only to threaten, but to reveal something about the traveller's own spirit, how much they could bear, how deeply they wanted the miracle they pursued. Still, fear occasionally rose to a level that felt unbearable. A figure moving beside the trees, a faint footstep trailing behind for too long, a distant voice carried by the wind. The pilgrim might tighten their grip on the staff, whisper a hurried prayer, or increase their pace along the narrow road. Turning back, however, was rarely a true option. Whatever danger waited at home, the illness, the debt, the shame, the grief, felt heavier than whatever prowled the woods. And so they continued, trembling but determined, caught between the darkness behind them and the possibility of grace ahead. As the road stretches onward and the night deepens, a simple, haunting question settles over the scene. When the road feels as though it wants you dead, do you move faster, trusting heaven to shield you? Or do you turn back and face the doom, waiting where you came from? The pilgrim chooses to continue, lantern trembling, breath sharp, feet sore. And here the narrator gently leads us toward the next mystery. How did anyone bear these dangers alone? The answer lies in the fragile protections, companions, and small sanctuaries that made survival possible, guiding us into the next section. The night road did not leave pilgrims entirely defenseless. Though danger pressed closely, people carried small protections that felt like threads binding them to safety. Charms stitched into clothing, pebbles taken from blessed springs, or tiny relics wrapped in cloth hung around their necks like whispers of courage. These were not grand objects, but humble signs of faith, reminders that unseen forces might watch over them. A pilgrim would touch a charm whenever fear rose sharply, letting the familiar shape settle their breath. The object held no guarantee, yet its presence softened the loneliness that pooled along the path. Groups offered another fragile layer of protection. Travelers sought companions not only for shared warmth or food, but because danger hesitated before numbers. A single lantern shining on the road felt vulnerable, but several lights moving together looked almost ceremonial, like a procession that spirits or wolves might avoid. Pilgrims walked in loose clusters, drifting apart and reforming as needed. They shared stories, prayers, and murmured songs that floated through the darkness as a boundary against despair. Even strangers became temporary guardians of one another, connected by the simple agreement to keep walking until dawn. When the forest grew too thick, or exhaustion dragged heavily at their limbs, pilgrims looked for roadside shrines. These were small sanctuaries, wooden crosses, stone altars, tiny chapels with crude paintings lit by a single candle. Some were barely more than shelters, but they carried quiet authority. Travelers approached them with reverence, believing each shrine marked a place where the divine had touched the world. Lighting a candle, or leaving an offering, felt like renewing a fragile pact with heaven. Even resting within sight of such a marker eased the dread that crept through the trees. Inside these simple shelters, time behaved strangely. Pilgrims often reported that nights spent near a holy image felt shorter than expected. Hours passed like minutes, or fear dissolved more quickly than seemed natural. Some thought the shrines bent time gently, softening the long stretch of darkness. Others believed the stillness there kept danger away, creating a pocket of calm in the vast night. They woke with the odd sense that dawn had arrived too quickly, as though something had watched over them and hurried the hours along to ensure their safety. Certain prayers were said to protect travellers from unseen harm. These were murmured under the breath, shaped by generations of repetition. A pilgrim might whisper a line whenever the wind shifted strangely, or when footsteps echoed incorrectly behind them. The words were not meant to command the world, but to steady the heart, creating a small interior space where fear lost its grip. Some believed these prayers formed invisible walls around them. Others thought the act of speaking reminded heaven of their presence in the dark. Whatever the explanation, the rhythm of whispered words anchored them against the night. Tiny relics carried on cords or tied inside clothing intensified these protections. Even the smallest fragment, a sliver of bone, a thread from a saint's garment, was believed to hold a spark of holiness. Pilgrims touched these relics during dangerous moments, trusting that the saint connected to the object might guide or shield them. Many recounted narrow escapes, wolves turning aside, storms easing suddenly, or strange lights flickering on distant hills as warnings. They interpreted these as signs that the relic had intervened. Whether coincidence or miracle, such stories travelled far, reinforcing the belief that even the smallest sacred object could shape the night. Travellers often formed temporary communities around these beliefs. A group might pause at a shrine, light candles, share bread, and speak of dangers survived. These gatherings created a brief warmth in the cold landscape. Someone would recount a night that passed too quickly, another a moment when footsteps behind vanished inexplicably. These stories stitched the group together, confirming that the road held mysteries beyond explanation. Pilgrims listened with equal parts fear and fascination, sensing that they walked within a network of forces both protective and unpredictable. Sometimes, the sense of protection became so strong that pilgrims believed time itself shifted for them. A journey expected to take days passed in fewer. A perilous night felt compressed into a brief dream. Exhausted travellers arrived at their next resting place earlier than expected, puzzled but grateful. Medieval chroniclers wrote about these anomalies carefully, avoiding bold claims yet leaving room for wonder. To the pilgrims themselves, such experiences were not errors in calculation, but whispers that heaven had intervened, smoothing the rough edges of time to help them survive the road. As the night wore on, the pilgrim in our story moves through these layers of protection. A small charm taps softly against his chest. A whispered prayer keeps his heart from racing. He follows the faint glow of a shrine ahead, hoping for rest. The lantern shakes in his hand, scattering light across roots and stones. Though fear follows him like a shadow, he trusts these fragile defenses because they are all he has. And somehow, they are enough to keep him moving forward into the deepening dark. In those moments, when survival felt too precise to be random, pilgrims sensed that the boundary between the earthly and the divine had thinned. They believed their footsteps were being guided, that someone unseen walked just ahead, clearing obstacles or shifting the shape of danger. These impressions were never spoken with certainty, yet they lingered in the mind like a soft echo. And so they continued, trusting that every mile survived carried a hidden meaning waiting to be understood. Fate, to the medieval mind, was not a hard, unchanging wall. It was more like a tapestry woven by many hands, divine, human, and sometimes dark each thread, capable of shifting if the right plea reached the right listener. The narrator draws us gently into this worldview, where life felt partly written, yet still open to influence through heavenly allies. Saints were not distant figures trapped in stained glass. They were believed to watch, to listen, and to intervene. Their relics, resting in tiny boxes or elaborate golden shrines, acted as physical handles on that invisible relationship, bridges between worlds. Pilgrims carried this belief like a quiet pulse beneath their clothing. Every prayer whispered into the night was not merely a hope but a negotiation. They asked saints to lean over the edge of heaven, to take notice of their situation, to adjust something small but crucial in the unfolding of their lives. Perhaps a fever could be shortened, a danger postponed, a blow turned aside. These were not grand miracles of the sort recorded in illuminated manuscripts. They were subtle redirections, almost like edits made to a sentence before ink fully dried. To pilgrims, such shifts felt entirely possible. Stories of these interventions drifted across Europe like sparks carried on wind. A man attacked on a lonely road claimed his attacker's knife glanced off a rib in a way that defied explanation. A young woman crossing a decayed bridge described feeling it give way beneath her, but only after her final step had landed safely on the far shore. A boy who had wandered into a wolf pack emerged with nothing more than scratches, insisting a tall figure in a hooded robe had walked between him and the snarling animals. Such accounts were not questioned. They were embraced as signs of heavenly editing. Some chroniclers even described these moments using language that sounds strangely modern, almost like someone revising a story rather than experiencing a miracle. They wrote that the sentence of death was shortened, or the appointed day was moved, or the danger meant for him was turned aside. They spoke of fate as a text, flexible under the right conditions. Pilgrims reading these accounts felt affirmed in their belief that the story of their own life could be softened, rearranged, or rewritten through devotion. The world felt less fixed, less merciless, shaped by a dialogue between mortal hope and divine compassion. This belief grew stronger in moments of personal survival. A pilgrim walking alone at dusk might hear footsteps behind them, following at a measured pace. Fear would rise. A whispered prayer, a desperate touch of a small relic beneath the cloak, and suddenly the footsteps would fade. Was it simply an animal turning aside, a person losing interest? Or something stranger, an unseen guardian stepping between threat and traveller? Pilgrims rarely analysed such moments. They accepted the outcome with gratitude, believing their saint had nudged destiny, shifting the moment just enough to let them pass unharmed. Other stories spoke of illnesses easing during the night. A feverish traveller would collapse near a shrine, expecting death, only to awaken at dawn with steady breath and clear thoughts. Sometimes the recovery was physical. Sometimes it was emotional, a sudden release from grief that had felt suffocating. Pilgrims believed these experiences showed the saint rewriting the story from within the body or mind, adjusting threads that bound suffering too tightly. These small shifts felt as miraculous as any grand healing. They reminded the traveller that fate was not a simple decree but a living script that might listen. A darker edge shaped these beliefs as well. Some pilgrims feared that failing to fulfill a vow could cause destiny to turn against them. If they promised to reach a shrine but faltered, they worried fate might tighten its grip, restoring the previous danger or letting misfortune catch up. In this worldview, the journey itself was a negotiation. Each mile walked showed sincerity. Each whispered prayer renewed the agreement. Each hardship endured testified to the pilgrim's commitment. The night road became both a physical passage and a spiritual contract, where every step strengthened the chance that the saint would intervene when needed. The narrator lingers on the emotional weight of this belief. Thinking that fate could bend was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant the pilgrim was not helpless. Terrifying because it implied responsibility. One had to keep moving, keep praying, keep reaching for the relic that might shift the story. Failure was no longer merely unfortunate. It felt like letting the script harden into something harsher. This tension sharpened every decision on the road. Turn left or right, rest or press on, speak a prayer or remain silent. Any choice might be the crucial one that heaven noticed. Yet in moments of deepest fear, this worldview offered immense solace. A pilgrim at the edge of exhaustion might feel a sudden warmth spreading through their chest, or sense a presence walking beside them, unseen but unmistakably near. Others spoke of hearing a voice guiding them away from danger, or seeing a faint light in the trees that led them towards safety. Whether the source was spiritual, psychological, or imagined mattered less than the feeling itself. These small mercies reminded them that they were not walking alone, that the path might be curved by compassionate hands. As the night deepens around our traveller, he feels this possibility hovering close. The dangers behind him and the darkness ahead seem to press equally hard, yet he continues. His fingers rest lightly on the relic beneath his cloak, a simple fragment that carries centuries of whispered hopes. Each step feels like a question posed to the unseen. Will you walk with me tonight? And with each breath, he senses that something might be listening. The narrator guides us toward the realization, forming quietly inside him, that relics were not mere objects but points of contact where fate itself could shift. And so, as he presses on through the shadowed path, a new curiosity rises. To understand why these relics held such influence, we must look deeper into what they were believed to be, not just fragments of bone or cloth, but vessels of presence. With this thought, the road opens toward the next chapter, where the inner logic of relic power waits to be explored. To understand relics, the narrator begins softly. We must understand how medieval people thought about bodies not as simple vessels of flesh, but as landscapes shaped by experience, discipline, and divine encounters. A saint's body, in this worldview, was not merely a corpse once life departed. It had been a chamber of extraordinary endurance, the dwelling place of prayers whispered through suffering, and the site of visions that touched the edge of heaven. The holiness believed to inhabit such a body did not vanish at death. It settled into the bones like a memory that refused to fade. This belief did not come from superstition alone. Medieval people saw the world as a place where matter held meaning. Just as a scar preserves the memory of a wound, or a tree bears the shape of past storms in its rings, they believed relics carried the imprint of a life lived in intimate closeness to the divine. A saint who had healed the sick or forgiven enemies not only performed sacred acts, but absorbed their significance into the very structure of their being. To approach their bones was to approach the lingering echo of those deeds. The narrator compares this to the way a bell continues to vibrate after being struck. The sound may fade, but the metal remembers. Or incense burned in a chapel. The smoke disappears, yet the fragrance lingers on walls and cloth. Relics were understood in a similar way. A saint's life had struck the world with uncommon force, and the resonance of that contact remained, even if faintly. Pilgrims believed these echoes could still move outward, touching those who sought them with humility and need, as if energy from centuries earlier had left traces in physical form. For the pilgrim kneeling before a reliquary, this logic felt natural. The relic was not simply there to be admired. It was a point of contact, a place where heaven had once drawn close to earth and might again if approached with sincerity. To touch a relic, or even to be in its presence, was to enter a zone where the boundary between human frailty and divine strength felt thinner. Prayers spoken there carried weight, not because the object possessed magic, but because the saint's life had carved a channel through which grace might still flow. This worldview becomes less foreign when the narrator invites the audience to reflect on their own habits. When someone keeps a sweater that belonged to a loved one, they do so because it retains something of the person, some warmth, some echo of moments shared. When people revisit a childhood home, a gravesite, or a place where a life event occurred, they feel the presence of memory in the air. Objects and places hold significance because emotion settles into them. This instinct is universal, not bound to any era, and suddenly the reliquary seems less strange. The narrator continues gently. When a medieval pilgrim walked for days to touch a bone, they were acting on the same impulse as someone who keeps a wedding ring tucked in a drawer or preserves letters long after the ink has faded. The difference lies only in scale. Where we feel emotional or symbolic meaning, they felt spiritual meaning. They believed that intense holiness behaved like intense emotion, leaving a mark that clung to matter. For them, the ring and the bone were not different in kind, but in magnitude. Both carried the memory of a life. One simply carried more. This idea of memory embedded in matter shaped how relics were displayed and protected. Churches built elaborate reliquaries not to elevate the object above people, but to honor the resonance they believed it contained. Gold, crystal, and carved wood served as guardians for something more fragile, the fading vibration of a holy life. Pilgrims approached these cases not with superstition but with tenderness, as if they were drawing close to a story still warm at the edges. Many wept quietly, sensing something alive inside the silence, a gentle reminder that compassion and sacrifice do not disappear completely. Relics also created bridges between time periods. A pilgrim living in hardship might kneel before a bone centuries old and feel a sudden kinship with the saint it belonged to. The distance between their lives collapsed. The saint's struggles, recorded in fading manuscripts or recited by wandering monks, no longer felt remote. The relic made those stories present. It carried the weight of suffering, kindness, and devotion across centuries, offering comfort to those who believed they walked a path the saint had once walked. Time became layered rather than linear, with relics forming luminous points around which memories gathered. This connection was more than emotional. Pilgrims believed relics retained some fragment of the saint's agency, a gentle ability to notice and respond. Not like a living person, but like a flame responding to breath. They imagined the bones listening in a quiet, patient way. When miracles were reported, illnesses eased, dangers avoided, pilgrims did not credit the object itself but the saint whose presence lingered through it. The relic was a doorway, but the hand that opened it existed elsewhere. This distinction mattered deeply. It kept devotion focused on the saint, not the matter alone. The narrator pauses to let this perspective settle. Relics, in essence, were memory made, physical memory intensified beyond anything we usually encounter. To stand near them was to feel the past reaching gently into the present. And so the pilgrim's belief becomes easier to understand. They were not chasing superstition, but the hope that something once touched by extraordinary compassion might still carry enough warmth to soften their own suffering. Having seen relics as carriers of memory, the narrator leads us toward a deeper question. What happens when these memories intertwine with ritual, repetition, and communal expectation over centuries? That question opens the path into the next section, where relics become landmarks not only in space but in time. A relic's power was not confined to its physical presence. Over time, it became a point around which stories repeated, rituals formed, and entire communities shaped their calendars. The narrator guides us into this widening circle, where relics were not just objects remembered, they were moments remembered, days remembered, events remembered so intensely that they seemed to press through the boundary of time. Feast days emerged, bound to the relic and the saint it represented. Year after year, people gathered to honor the same story, and each retelling strengthened the sense that the past was not gone, but waiting just beyond reach. At dawn on such days, the churches filled long before the bells began to ring. Pilgrims arrived from distant regions, their footsteps stirring dust along the roads that wound toward the shrine. Inside the sanctuary, candles multiplied in trembling rows, each flame offering its small contribution to the glow. Light touched the reliquary, turning gold brighter, crystal clearer, silver sharper. As the crowd inhaled together, it felt as though the relic had awakened. The sound of prayers layered upon one another, forming a soft hum that vibrated through the stone floor, like the faint heartbeat of an old story returning. Processions began with deliberate slowness. The relic was lifted, sometimes in a small chest, sometimes in a towering shrine, and carried through the streets like a living presence. People pressed forward, straining to see, to touch the air near it, to feel the moment pass close enough for its warmth to brush them. Children clung to their mother's clothing, wide-eyed. Old men bowed their heads, whispering names of those they hoped the saint would remember. The bells above swung with rhythmic force, their pealing echoing across rooftops and hills, stitching past and present together in each vibrating note. These rituals were more than public ceremonies. They were reenactments, carefully shaped to mirror the saint's life. A martyr's feast might include reenacted trials or prayers recited at the exact hour of their death. A healer's day might involve the blessing of the sick, each gesture echoing acts performed centuries earlier. As generations repeated these actions, something strange began to happen. People no longer felt they were remembering a distant event. They felt they were stepping into it. The saint's story brushed close. Its edges softened, its moments aligned with their own in the flickering light of sacred time. This sense deepened within the church walls during long vigils. As midnight approached, the sanctuary seemed to breathe differently. The narrator describes the atmosphere with a hushed reverence, incense settling in visible layers, shadows bending around pillars, and the faint glow of the reliquary floating in darkness like an anchored star. Stories circulated of people who claimed to feel a shift, an inner tilt, a soft tremor, a moment when the boundary between their heartbeat and the events of the saint's life grew thin. Some said they felt watched, not by eyes of judgment but by a presence remembering its own past. Medieval writers struggled to describe this sensation. They used language that feels almost scientific in its ambiguity. Time folded upon itself, holy moments rising into the present, hours borrowed from another age. The implication was subtle yet profound. These feast days did not merely commemorate history, they reopened it. They created windows through which the past could seep quietly into the now. People believed that miracles were more likely during these hours because the saint, in some mysterious sense, drew closer. The relic anchored this convergence, holding the hinge steady while time swung backwards and forwards at once. Outside the church, the larger world responded to these rhythms. Markets flourished around feast days, with merchants gathering to sell goods to the influx of pilgrims. Musicians played in the roads, craftsmen displayed carvings of saints, bakers prepared special loaves shaped like symbols of the feast. Villages transformed into temporary cities of celebration. Yet beneath the noise, a quiet acknowledgement persisted. This day was different. It did not feel like other days. It had a texture, a weight, a resonance. People walked more slowly, spoke more softly, as though aware they were moving within borrowed hours. Pilgrims described leaving such celebrations with the uncanny feeling that they had stepped out of one layer of time into another. They returned home carrying more than memories. They carried impressions, a sense of closeness they could not explain, a shiver of recognition when they looked at the sky, a belief that something had pressed its shape briefly against their lives. Some felt transformed, even if nothing dramatic had happened. Others returned year after year, seeking the same timeless moment, longing to be caught once more in the overlap between their own fragile days and the saint's enduring story. The narrator pauses to note that this phenomenon has echoes in the modern world. When people revisit places tied to important events, a graduation hall, a hospital room, a childhood street, they feel time tug. They sense themselves inhabiting multiple layers at once. Who they were then, who they are now, and the lingering presence of a moment that refuses to fully release its hold. Relic feasts intensified this feeling. By surrounding the relic with ritual repetition, chanting, processions, and candlelight, medieval communities created deliberate time loops, spaces where the past could step forward and breathe again. At the center of all this stood the relic, silent and unmoving. To the medieval mind, it was not simply a reminder of the saint, it was the anchor point that allowed these timefold experiences to occur. Without the relic, the ceremony might feel empty. With it, the air shifted. The object grounded the community in a story older than any one generation, older even than the buildings that sheltered it. People believed that the relic held the imprint not only of the saint's life, but of the holy moments connected to it. When the relic was present, time listened differently. And so the narrator gently leads us toward the next realization. When relics became hinges in time and centers of communal ritual, they also accumulated enormous power, social, economic, and political. The ability to shape the rhythms of days and the emotions of crowds created influence that stretched far beyond prayer. Understanding this rising authority draws us into the next section, where relics become not only symbols of faith but instruments of control woven into the very fabric of medieval society. Power grew around relics the way moss grows on stone, slowly, naturally, and almost imperceptibly at first. The narrator guides us into this world, where the sacred and the political intertwined so gently that people barely recognized when devotion became leverage. A relic was believed to hold divine memory, but it also held influence. Whoever protected that memory, whether a bishop, an abbot, or an entire town, found themselves at the center of decisions that shaped villages and kingdoms alike. This power didn't announce itself loudly. It settled into daily life, shaping expectations with the quiet weight of something everyone trusted. Pilgrims arriving at a shrine did not think in terms of politics. They came with trembling hopes and private wounds. Yet their presence transformed the places that sheltered relics. Offerings filled chests. Markets grew along the paths. Inns multiplied. Musicians and craftsmen followed the crowds. A relic could turn a forgotten settlement into a thriving hub, and towns understood this well. They took pride in the saint's presence, guarding the relic fiercely, yet also knowing sometimes guiltily that their prosperity depended on those bones, that cloth, that tiny fragment of something holy lying still in its casket. Rulers, too, recognized the influence radiating from shrines. A king preparing for war might kneel before a relic to seek blessing, believing the saint's favor could tilt an entire campaign. Court advisors took note of which church he visited and which relic he chose. These actions were messages, subtle but unmistakable alignments of spiritual and political legitimacy. A ruler who gained the support of a powerful shrine gained the confidence of his people, who trusted that heaven itself had lent approval. And thus a relic, silent behind gold bars, guided decisions made far beyond the church walls. Oaths sworn before relics held particular gravity. Medieval people believed saints listened when invoked, noting who kept promises and who broke them. Agreements finalized near relics were considered sealed not only by human witnesses, but by the saint's enduring presence. Breaking such an oath risked punishment not from a ruler but from heaven. This belief created a quiet pressure that church leaders understood well. They reminded nobles that decisions made before relics carried consequences, weaving spiritual accountability into political life. The truth was simple. People obeyed more readily when they felt unseen. Eyes watched from beyond mortality. At times, relics became tools in negotiations. A bishop might refuse to display a relic unless a ruler resolved a dispute or fulfilled an overdue promise. Clergy rarely framed this as manipulation. Instead, they spoke of ritual appropriateness, that the saint should not be disturbed during times of discord. Yet everyone sensed the leverage behind such decisions. The presence or absence of a relic during festivals or visits shaped the moods of crowds, the confidence of leaders, and the willingness of pilgrims to travel. Even withholding a relic for a single feast day could send ripples of anxiety through a region. There were also stranger, more dramatic uses of relics. Chronicles tell of communities facing drought or plague, carrying relics through the streets in solemn processions. People believed these journeys pulled divine mercy toward them. But these events influenced more than weather or illness, they shaped social cohesion. Leaders who organized such processions gained trust. Those who hesitated or mismanaged them risked blame. The relic became a barometer of public confidence, its movements watched with intense hope. In moments of crisis, the relic guided not only prayers, but the entire emotional climate of a town holding its breath. Some communities, desperate for relevance or survival, resorted to bold measures. There were accounts of discoveries made at suspiciously convenient times, bones located exactly when pilgrimage traffic dwindled, or visions reported just when a church faced financial ruin. A shepherd might dream of a saint pointing to a hillside. A child might stumble upon a buried box. These stories can be read cynically, but the narrator refuses that path. Some were surely staged, but others may have arisen from genuine longing. People needed signs. They needed hope. And so the line between miracle and invention blurred in ways both troubling and deeply human. Communities sometimes fought over relics, each claiming divine endorsement. When disagreements erupted, they often became symbolic battles about identity. A relic determined which town festivals would flourish, which markets would thrive, which routes pilgrims would favor. Losing a relic meant losing influence, pride, and sometimes economic stability. Some groups stole relics, convinced the saint wished to be moved. Others hid them to prevent theft. These actions were framed as acts of devotion, even when ambition played a part. The relic was alive in their minds, capable of choosing, approving, disapproving, uprooting, or settling as circumstances required. Yet amid all these political undercurrents, the narrator emphasizes a quieter, gentler truth. Most people involved were sincere believers. Priests who guarded relics felt genuine responsibility. They believed the saint entrusted them with care, guidance, and intercession. When they leveraged relics to influence rulers or communities, many felt they acted out of duty rather than ambition. The saint's will, in their minds, shaped their decisions. Politics, piety, fear, and hope wove together so tightly that motives became inseparable. This was not manipulation in a modern sense. It was a world where power and holiness lived side by side in the same breath. And always, at the center of everything, stood the individual pilgrim, unaware of strategies, insensitive to political tensions, caring nothing for civic pride. They approached the relic with trembling hands, seeking comfort, healing, or forgiveness. Their sincerity grounded the entire system. Without that personal longing, relics would have been lifeless objects. But countless pilgrims believed, and their belief gave relics an undeniable force that even the powerful could not ignore. The saint's memory, held in bone or cloth, shaped the pilgrim's destiny and, in turn, the fate of towns and kingdoms woven around that devotion. As the narrator pulls away from these intertwined forces, we return to the image of a lone pilgrim walking the night road. Behind him lies a landscape shaped by relics, by belief, by politics, by hope. Ahead lies only uncertainty. To understand his journey fully, we must explore how medieval people saw themselves within the sweeping story of time and destiny. That question leads us into the next chapter, where the inner architecture of medieval fate awaits. Time, for the medieval mind, was not an even river flowing steadily from past to future. It was a layered, breathing thing, full of meanings, warnings, and moments when the unseen world pressed closer. The narrator invites us into this worldview slowly, explaining that people believed their lives were woven into a vast tapestry, stretching from the creation of the world to its final judgment. Each thread, each person was part of a pattern known only to God. Days were not blank containers to be filled with chores or rest. They carried weight, shaped by feasts, fasts, saints' days, and sacred seasons that pulsed like the heartbeat of the year. In this world, time was both a teacher and a signpost. A farmer waking before dawn to tend his fields might look to the sky and see more than weather. An unexpected frost could hint at divine displeasure. A bright comet might signal coming upheaval. An eclipse might cause entire villages to gather in silence, believing the heavens were revealing something about the shape of days to come. Medieval people lived with a constant awareness that every moment belonged to a larger story, unfolding above and around them, even when they could not grasp its full meaning. This awareness shaped daily decisions. If a child fell ill in early spring, a parent might see it as part of a pattern stretching back through generations, perhaps a reminder of ancestral vows or forgotten prayers. If a bad harvest followed years of plenty, villagers wondered whether their collective thread in the tapestry was fraying, whether something had slipped out of balance. When lightning struck too close, when a neighbor died unexpectedly, when strange dreams haunted a household, people looked not only inward but upward, searching for hints that their place in the cosmic weaving needed attention. Against this backdrop, pilgrimage emerged not merely as travel, but as an attempt to step deliberately into the loom itself. A pilgrim leaving home at dawn understood they were entering a space where time felt different, more responsive, more meaningful. The decision to walk toward a relic, a shrine, or a holy site was a way of appealing to the weaver of the tapestry. If life felt twisted or unraveling, perhaps the journey could adjust the thread, smoothing a snag or redirecting a knot of misfortune. A pilgrimage was not rebellion, it was a humble request for realignment. The narrator makes this idea vivid by asking us to imagine time as a cloth shimmering with movement. Each life is a line running through it. Most days, people follow their line quietly, trusting that God has set its course, but sometimes the cloth puckers. Death comes early, hunger stalks a village, accidents strike again and again. In these moments, medieval people believed they could tug carefully on their thread through prayer, penance, sacrifice, or travel. Not to break the pattern, but to ask for help reshaping it. This tugging wasn't an act of arrogance, it was an act of yearning. The narrator gently reminds the viewer that this perspective differs from the modern idea of fate as unchangeable or random. Medieval Christians saw destiny as something held in a divine hand, but softened by compassion. God listened. Saints interceded. Time itself was permeable, willing to shift in response to devotion. A pilgrimage became a physical expression of that belief, the slow, aching movement of the body mirroring the soul's plea. Walking was praying. Every mile carried intention. Every hardship became an offering placed before heaven, as though pain itself stitched a new line into the tapestry. To make this worldview more relatable, the narrator turns to the modern listener. Have you ever felt a certain day was meant for something? Have you ever sensed that a decision pulled at your life in ways you couldn't explain? Have you ever felt trapped in a pattern and longed to break it, or feared a change that seemed to come from nowhere? The medieval mind was not primitive, it was attentive. It noticed the rhythm of things. It interpreted coincidence as communication. And it believed that destiny, like all woven cloth, could be repaired when it began to fray around the edges. The emotional heart of the section rests on a simple image. A farmer standing alone at dusk, watching a sick child sleep fitfully. He feels helpless, aware that life may be slipping toward a future he dreads. But he also feels the faint tug of possibility. If he walks to the shrine 3 valleys away, if he offers days of hunger and miles of danger, perhaps the saint will speak on his family's behalf. Perhaps the tapestry can shift. The narrator lingers on this moment not to romanticize hardship, but to show the courage behind such decisions. A pilgrimage is a plea carved into motion. This leads to the engagement spike, the unsettling question at the center of medieval spirituality. If God has woven the pattern, how dare a simple person ask for it to be changed? The narrator does not dismiss this conflict. Instead, they explain that medieval Christians lived in a tension between humility and hope. They believed God was both just and merciful. Fate was both written and revisable. A pilgrim walked the night road, knowing they were small, one thread among millions, yet believing their smallness did not disqualify them from compassion. Asking for help felt audacious, but not forbidden. The section closes with the pilgrim on the night road again, lantern shaking, heart unsteady, yet driven by the conviction that the tapestry of his life might still be adjusted. He does not know whether his plea will be heard. He only knows that staying home would mean surrendering to the fraying pattern he fears. And so he walks, carrying both humility and daring in equal measure. As the narrator softens their voice, they guide us toward the next question. If destiny can shift, who can persuade it to shift? This leads us gently into section 5.2, where saints become intermediaries in the grand weaving of time. Saints, to the medieval imagination, were not distant figures resting silently in heaven. They were living presences, friends in high places, capable of compassion, attention, and intervention. The narrator eases us into this idea gently, explaining that medieval Christians believed saints could carry human petitions upward, softening judgments that might otherwise unfold harshly. God was just, yes, but also merciful. Saints were the bridges between those qualities. They had endured suffering, resisted temptation, and remained faithful. Their closeness to the divine made them advocates, able to bend the unfolding of events on behalf of those who sought them with sincere hearts. This belief was woven through daily life. A mother worried about her child's fever might whisper the name of a saint associated with healing. A soldier preparing for a dangerous campaign might carry a relic sewn into his clothing, trusting the saint connected to it to watch over him on the battlefield. A traveller braving a winter road might murmur a saint's prayer with each step, hoping for guidance. Such gestures were not seen as superstition, but as practical appeals to intercessors who understood human weakness. Saints were not above emotion. They were believed to be deeply moved by devotion. Relics, tied intimately to these saints, became the physical evidence of their nearness. Touching a relic felt like knocking on the door of the saint's chamber. Pilgrims believed the saint could hear through the bone, the cloth, the fragment of wood. The relic was not the saint, but it carried the saint's memory, and memory was a channel. A pilgrim kneeling before a reliquary was not appealing to an object but speaking to a friend, one who had lived, struggled, suffered, and triumphed. That history made saints uniquely qualified to understand the complexities of human fear, hope, and frailty. The narrator paints quiet, intimate scenes that echo across centuries. A mother kneeling in a dim chapel, forehead pressed to cold stone, whispering pleas for her child's life. A young soldier gripping a tiny relic before dawn, knowing the coming day may be his last. An old man praying for a peaceful death instead of a sudden one that might rob him of preparation. These moments unfold not in grand cathedrals, but in small chapels, roadside shrines, or lonely hillsides. Each plea is shaped not by arrogance, but by longing. The supplicant isn't seeking control, only mercy. What pilgrims asked for was not a rewritten destiny, but a softened one. If illness could not be entirely removed, perhaps it could be eased. If danger could not be eliminated, perhaps it could be delayed. If death must come, perhaps it could come gently. Medieval prayer was realistic, grounded in the harshness of daily life. People did not ask for perfection, only for the edges of fate to be rounded slightly. Saints were believed to have the authority to request such adjustments. They knew humanity's limits and pleaded accordingly, their compassion shaping the tone of divine response. The wait what moment arises when the narrator describes stories where people claim to have received visions confirming their fate had indeed been revised. A woman who had expected to die young dreamed of a figure extending her thread. A man who narrowly escaped drowning believed he saw his saint pushing the water back. Another, rescued from a collapsing roof, later said he witnessed hands lifting the beam just long enough for him to crawl free. Whether these were dreams, psychological comforts, or something more, medieval people interpreted them as divine communication, reassurance that their voices had been heard. Such stories spread quickly, carried by travelers, merchants, and priests. Communities listened with reverence to tales of rescue, healing, or miraculous timing. These accounts reinforced the belief that intercession was real. Even skeptics often softened when they heard such testimonies. It was difficult to dismiss the trembling sincerity of a mother, claiming her child recovered unexpectedly after she prayed beside a shrine. These narratives became part of the spiritual fabric of medieval society, giving people courage to attempt their own appeals. The idea that heaven might listen was enough to send thousands onto the road. Yet the narrator quietly acknowledges that asking for change required immense courage. Medieval Christians believed the universe was ordered by divine wisdom. To request a shift in that order felt bold, almost dangerous. What if the plea was too large? What if God denied it? What if asking revealed selfishness rather than faith? These fears accompanied pilgrims in the dark, shaping their prayers with humility. The journey toward a relic was not simply a physical act, it was a test of intention. One had to approach with sincerity, trusting the saint to discern what was worthy of adjustment. The narrator also describes moments when people wondered whether their requests had been heard even before they reached the shrine. A traveller might feel a sudden calm as though a weight had lifted. An illness might ease just enough to permit the next day's walking. A threatening storm might break apart unexpectedly, allowing safe passage. Such experiences were interpreted as signs that the saint was already interceding. Pilgrims read meaning into these gentle shifts, believing the process of negotiation had begun. The shrine became not the start of the plea but its culmination, a final gesture of gratitude or desperation. This belief in heavenly intervention shaped courage in subtle ways. A pilgrim walking alone at night might whisper a saint's name when fear surged, trusting the saint to widen the road or dim the threat. If footsteps behind faded or a wolf's howl shifted direction, the pilgrim interpreted this as protection at work. Even small mercies, an unexpected companion, a lantern found still burning in an abandoned shelter, were read as signs. These interpretations were not naive. They reflected a world where meaning flowed constantly between the seen and unseen, guided by the hands of saints attentive to human fragility. The narrator begins softly, acknowledging that behind every prayer asking for a changed future lies a trembling uncertainty. What if altering fate comes with consequences unseen? Medieval pilgrims rarely spoke these fears aloud, but they lived with them. To step onto a pilgrimage road was to engage in a quiet negotiation with the structure of reality. If saints could intervene, could they also rearrange suffering, redirecting misfortune from one person to another? This possibility lingered in the shadows of devotion, unsettling but impossible to ignore. The narrator invites us to enter this fragile emotional territory gently, without judgment. Some stories whispered across villages hinted at the darker edge of answered prayers. One tale tells of a woman who begged for her dying husband's life, walking barefoot for miles to reach a distant shrine. The man recovered slowly, miraculously, but weeks later her brother fell ill and died unexpectedly. She carried a lifelong unease, wondering whether time had borrowed from one life to restore another. No priest confirmed such fears. No doctrine taught this. Yet the human heart, wary of bargains too favorable, sometimes sees balance where none was intended. Such stories spread not as accusations, but as haunted questions. Another account describes a young traveller who survived a fall from a collapsing bridge. He insisted that a luminous figure steadied him at the last instant. The village celebrated his survival, calling it a miracle. But the traveller himself grew troubled. Days later, another pilgrim fell from the same bridge and died. The survivor wondered if fate had rearranged itself, granting him time at the cost of another. He attended the funeral in silence, carrying gratitude and guilt in uneasy, equal measure. Medieval people understood that miracles were comforting, but they could also provoke quiet disquiet in thoughtful minds. The narrator emphasizes that these stories were not common teachings. Churches did not claim miracles caused harm to others, but people living close to hunger, disease, and sudden death sensed that life often involved strange exchanges. If God could shift the tapestry, might the threads cross, tighten, or pull unexpectedly? This fear did not lessen devotion. Instead, it made devotion more solemn. Pilgrims approached relics with humility, aware that asking for too much felt dangerous. Their prayers often included caveats: if it is your will, if it harms no one, if mercy may be multiplied. Caution softened every plea. Preachers occasionally gave warnings that echoed this anxiety. They urged believers to ask carefully, reminding them that suffering could hold hidden purpose. Some cautioned that pressing too hard for change might disturb the balance of divine plans. These warnings were rarely strict prohibitions. They were more like reminders that humans saw only part of the tapestry. Tugging too boldly on one's thread might ripple outward in ways they could not see. Medieval listeners took these cautions seriously, weaving them into the emotional texture of pilgrimage. It was not fear of punishment, it was fear of unintended consequence. One story tells of an elderly monk who prayed for deliverance from a lingering illness. His pain eased for a time, allowing him to walk once more. But the monastery suffered a harsh winter soon after, taking the lives of 2 younger brothers. For the rest of his days, he wondered whether his prayer had been answered too generously. He did not blame God or the saint. Instead, he blamed his own uncertainty, his inability to accept suffering quietly. Whether his reasoning was theologically accurate mattered little. Emotion has its own logic, and in the medieval world, that logic carried powerful weight. The narrator pauses to draw a connection to the modern listener. Even today, people sometimes feel survivor's guilt, or wonder whether fortune in one area of life is balanced by hardship in another. Parents ask why one child thrives while another struggles. Friends question why danger missed them but struck someone else. These thoughts are not uniquely medieval. They are human attempts to find meaning in an unpredictable world. The medieval fear that fate might balance itself through hidden exchanges reflects a universal anxiety, that blessings might come with costs we cannot see. Yet amid these fears, pilgrims continued to walk. Their willingness reveals something profound about the human heart. People crave hope even when it frightens them. They prayed with trembling, trusting that saints understood the depth of their longing. They believed that saints would never harm one soul to protect another. Still, uncertainty remained a shadow cast by the possibility of unintended consequences. This shadow did not extinguish faith, but it added complexity. Pilgrims prayed, not only for mercy, but for the wisdom to ask gently. They begged for protection without causing harm, for intervention without disruption. The narrator introduces another unsettling dimension. What if a person received an answer they did not fully want? Medieval accounts describe people who prayed for extended life, only to outlive their families. Others begged to avoid a particular danger, only to face a different one. Fate occasionally bent, but not always in predictable directions. These stories were not framed as punishments. Instead, they were mysteries, reminders that even altered paths contain sorrow. A miracle could bring relief and grief in equal measure. A redirection might spare one pain, but lead into another, no less burdensome. Still, pilgrims believed the risk was worth taking. To remain passive felt like surrender. To walk, to pray, to ask, these were acts of courage. Accepting whatever came after was part of the bargain. A pilgrim might kneel before a relic and whisper, "If it is too much to ask, tell me." They longed not only for deliverance, but for permission to desire change. This emotional honesty formed the core of medieval spirituality. Saints were not approached as cosmic vending machines, but as companions in fear, capable of understanding the trembling complexity of human wishes. As the narrator draws the section toward its close, the image returns to the solitary pilgrim walking under a sky heavy with stars. He carries the same fears others whispered across centuries, the anxiety that asking for mercy might ripple into another life, the guilt of wondering whether survival steals from someone else's fate, the quiet hope that saints know how to adjust the tapestry without tearing it. These thoughts travel with him as surely as his lantern and his relic. Yet he walks. Because not walking means accepting despair, and walking means daring to hope, however complicated that hope becomes. The narrator begins with a soft, echoing calm, guiding the viewer into the shadowed corridors of medieval authority. Relics may have held the memory of saints, but the church determined who could approach that memory and when. Bishops, abbots, canons, and casters of keys all stood between pilgrims and the sacred. Their decisions shaped not only ritual but the very flow of fate-seeking souls. In a world where touching a saint's bone might rewrite the path of a life, access became power. The narrator lingers on this truth. Spiritual hunger always met a structure of doors, rules, and guardians. Churches that held major relics operated with a sense of reverence, yes, but also with the careful management of a royal treasury. Some shrines allowed pilgrims to stand close during feast days, letting hundreds press forward in breathless waves. Others kept relics behind iron screens, visible only by candlelight flickering through bars. A pilgrim could travel for weeks, only to find the object of their hope locked in a chamber they were not permitted to enter. The church, believing it protected the sacred from misuse, established layers of distance between relic and devotee. These boundaries varied across Europe. In some regions, relics were displayed openly in vast halls, where common people stood shoulder to shoulder with nobles. In others, special chapels were reserved for the wealthy, who could pay for private viewing or receive blessings directly from priests entrusted with relic care. A noble family might spend hours in silent communion before a relic a peasant could see only for seconds from across a crowded nave. The narrator lets the viewer feel this tension. Holiness itself might have been universal, but access to it rarely was. The church justified these hierarchies through a mixture of caution and tradition. Relics were fragile, they argued, vulnerable to wear, theft, and irreverence. Too much touching, too many crowds, too many eager hands could degrade them. And yet another truth nestled quietly beneath the surface. Where access was restricted, authority deepened. A bishop who controlled when the reliquary opened controlled the emotional temperature of an entire region. An abbot who decided which pilgrims received proximity became a quiet arbiter of hope. The keys that locked the shrine were as symbolic as they were practical. The narrator shifts the scene to a specific pilgrim. A tired, dust-covered traveller, arriving at a grand cathedral just after dusk. His journey has been long. He has risked wolves, bandits, hunger, and cold, and now he stands before massive doors barred from within. Guards inform him that the relic will not be displayed again until sunrise. The pilgrim nods, though worry flickers across his face. What if he cannot stay? What if danger forces him onward? What if the chance he sought so desperately depends on a schedule he never knew? This moment captures the fragile intersection between personal longing and institutional rhythm. Restrictions intensified after scandals. The narrator recounts documented cases where relics were mishandled, paraded too often, touched too aggressively, or claimed by competing groups. In response, bishops locked them away for months or even years. Rumors of misuse circulated, though few knew the truth. Pilgrims would arrive from distant lands only to discover the shrine closed. Some wept on church steps. Others remained outside for nights, praying through shutters with no answer. The institution believed it was acting responsibly. But to the traveller who staked his hope on this visit, the locked door felt like destiny sealed by human regulation. Relics could also be relocated without warning, sometimes for protection, sometimes for politics, sometimes for reasons never shared. A shrine's reputation might attract unwanted attention, thieves seeking precious metals, or rival towns claiming rights to the relic. Priests moved the relic to safer locations, but the secrecy surrounding such moves created frustration. Pilgrims arrived to find empty altars or cryptic notices. Where did the relic go? Would it return? Was the saint displeased? The narrator describes the quiet heartbreak of such moments, the feeling that the path to bending fate was itself uncertain, fragile, even unstable. Amid these restrictions, permissions and donations became intertwined. A wealthy patron could request a special viewing for their household, bypassing crowds waiting for the next procession. A nobleman might fund repairs to the church roof and receive, in return, an hour alone with the relic. A bishop might grant access to monks or scholars for theological study. None of this was framed as favoritism. Instead, it was presented as honoring those who supported the shrine's upkeep. Yet the implications were clear. In the realm of fate and mercy, influence mattered. The narrator returns to the night pilgrim who waits outside locked doors. Around him, others drift into alcoves or press hands against cold stone, whispering prayers that seep through the cracks. Monks move quietly along corridors, carrying keys and candlelight, silhouettes of authority against the gold-lit gloom. The pilgrim realizes that even after surviving the dangers of the road, his final steps depend on gatekeepers who decide when the sacred becomes accessible. Hope becomes a negotiation not with heaven, but with human guardians of heaven's echoes. This truth settles heavily, revealing the intricate web of faith and power. Yet the narrator does not demonize these gatekeepers. Many acted with sincerity, believing they protected relics from irreverence or danger. They bore responsibility for sacred memory and feared being judged harshly if relics were damaged. Some prayed before opening the shrine, asking the saint for guidance. Others sat up through the night, guarding relics from thieves. The institution's structure was imperfect, but its heartbeat was shaped by devotion. Still, the tension remained. When the sacred was mediated through human hands, human limitations inevitably shaped the path to grace. The narrator opens this section with a slow drift over the landscape surrounding major shrines, villages, towns, and crossroads, transformed not by chance, but by the steady pulse of passing pilgrims. While the church guarded the relics themselves, the world around them became a living marketplace built from wandering hope. Pilgrimage was never only a spiritual act, it was also movement, hunger, exhaustion, and need. Every traveller required food, shelter, safety, clothing, candles, offerings, and sometimes healing. Around these needs grew a network of livelihoods, subtle but powerful, shaping local economies in ways both visible and quietly transformative. Near the biggest shrines, roads thickened with stalls. Merchants sold bread still warm from the oven, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, knives for cutting roots, and travelling cloaks to replace those worn through. Artisans carved small badges, simple stamped metal tokens bearing the emblem of the shrine, so pilgrims could prove they had completed their journey. Tavern owners built extra rooms, each filled with laughter, stories, or the soft weeping of travellers, finally reaching safety after nights on the dangerous road. Everything a pilgrim needed could be found here, if they had coins or barter to offer. Town councils quickly realized that pilgrims brought more than prayers, they brought opportunity. A steady stream of travellers meant bustling markets, wealth circulating through hands that rarely saw such silver otherwise. Councils lobbied for improved roads, smoother bridges, safer crossings, hoping to attract more pilgrims. They sponsored festivals honouring local saints, each designed to remind distant travellers that their shrine offered both holiness and hospitality. Sometimes political leaders negotiated protection for pilgrims, hiring guards or funding patrols, knowing that a reputation for safety drew even larger crowds to their gates. Competition between routes emerged as naturally as river branches competing for rainfall. Some towns boasted that their path was safer, their inns warmer, their relics closer to miracles. Others circulated stories of bandits haunting rival roads or wolves stalking competing territories. These tales were rarely outright lies. They were exaggerations shaped by pride and practical interest. The narrator allows us to hear the unspoken logic. The more pilgrims a town received, the more trade flourished. And so each community nurtured its reputation as carefully as a farmer tends a fragile crop. Even rulers became involved. Kings funded bridges along favoured pilgrimage routes, earning gratitude from travellers and clergy alike. Nobles built hostels along their lands, earning both income and prestige. Some endowed chapels at remote waypoints, knowing that weary pilgrims would stop to rest, pray, and donate. These acts were framed as generosity, but they also served practical aims. A kingdom full of active pilgrimage routes enjoyed more trade, more movement, more communication. Pilgrimage woven into infrastructure strengthened political cohesion, stitching scattered settlements together through shared roads and shared stories. The narrator guides us next into the dim interiors of taverns and inns, where travellers gathered after long days on dusty paths. These places became microcosms of the pilgrimage world. Merchants listened closely to pilgrims' stories not only for interest, but to learn which shrines were gaining fame, which rumours of miracles were spreading, which towns were becoming dangerous. A single whispered tale of a healing at a distant shrine could prompt traders to change their routes, investing in badges or tokens for the next wave of travellers. Stories, like goods, circulated with value attached. This brings us to the engagement spike, the possibility that some stories of miracles or visions did not emerge solely from pious mouths, but from those who benefited quietly from growing crowds. Not fabrication necessarily, but gentle encouragement. A merchant who overheard a pilgrim claim they felt a strange warmth near a relic might retell the moment with slightly more colour. A tavern owner might emphasise a story of protection on their favoured route. A town council might subtly amplify reports of a miraculous survival, ensuring the tale travelled further than the original witness intended. Such nurturing of stories does not erase their sincerity, it multiplies their reach. The narrator does not accuse medieval communities of cynicism. Instead, they reveal a complex truth. When belief and livelihood intertwined, people learned how to shape narratives like gardeners pruning vines. A miracle story tended carefully could blossom into crowds lasting years. A single tale of a relic bending fate could ripple through markets, inns, and taverns, bringing waves of travellers seeking hope, healing, or protection. In this sense, the economy of pilgrimage was made not only of goods, but of stories. We shift now to the bustling squares during feast days, where nobles, merchants, and pilgrims mingled in shared anticipation. Nobles often arrived with entourages, their presence lending prestige to the shrine. They made donations, sponsored masses, or purchased elaborate offerings to present before the relic. Such gestures reinforced their public image as protectors of the sacred and aligned them with the spiritual authority of the church. Meanwhile, merchants positioned themselves carefully where noble courts paused, knowing that elite patronage spread wealth and influence throughout the marketplace. Behind the scenes, town councils managed logistics invisible to most visitors. They negotiated with clergy for optimal procession routes, balanced crowd control with festival grandeur, and determined which vendors received prime positions near the shrine. These decisions shaped the financial lives of dozens of families. A single placement near a popular route could sustain a merchant for months. This invisible machinery ensured that pilgrimage remained not only a spiritual flow, but an economic current, carrying prosperity into the hands of those positioned wisely within its path. The narrator guides us gently toward the edges of the pilgrimage world, where torchlight fades, rules blur, and human desperation curls into the shadows. Along the well-traveled routes, devotion and commerce mingled openly. But beyond the marked roads and guarded shrines, another layer existed, one shaped by uncertainty, cunning, and fear. These were the spaces inhabited by false guides, relic dealers, and wanderers who slipped between roles as easily as changing cloaks. Not saints, not villains, but figures whose lives unfolded along the frayed border between sacred hope and human exploitation. Their presence added an uneasy tension to every night traveler's steps. Pilgrims spoke quietly of guides who appeared at dusk offering protection for a fair price. Some were genuine wanderers familiar with the land, willing to share knowledge of safe paths, hidden springs, or abandoned shelters. But others waited for foreigners and the vulnerable. These impostors learned how to mimic the mannerisms of seasoned travelers' worn cloaks, confident footsteps, soft reassurances in the dark. Once trust was gained, they might lead a small group into a thicket, demand payment, or disappear entirely, leaving frightened pilgrims alone in a maze of trees. Fear turned to confusion. Confusion turned to danger. Relic sellers were even harder to judge. They spoke softly, carrying bundles wrapped in linen, claiming to possess fragments of saints or holy objects gathered from distant shrines. Some offered a sliver of bone, a thread of cloth, a piece of wood said to have been touched by martyrdom. These items could steady a pilgrim's resolve, offering spiritual armor against wolves, sickness, or sorcery. Yet many of these sellers were skilled artisans of deception, carving bones from animals or staining cloth with herbs to mimic age. Their goods were too convincing, and pilgrims, exhausted or frightened, bought hope without questioning its source. The narrator emphasizes that the line between genuine relic and false one was not always clear even to the clergy, let alone to travelers. Pilgrims carried these objects close to their hearts, trusting them to protect the long journey home. And sometimes, strangely, protection did seem to follow. A traveler clutching a forged relic might escape a falling branch, avoid a bandit's ambush, or feel a sudden burst of courage when fear nearly overwhelmed them. These coincidences raised an uncanny question. If an object was fake but helped someone survive, what exactly had been offering protection? Belief, memory, or something deeper? Stories circulated about pilgrim bands that offered companionship on dangerous routes. Some functioned like temporary families, sharing bread, guarding sleeping members, and singing hymns to keep away fear. But others carried darker intentions. A group might welcome a lone traveler warmly, then rob them as soon as they reached a deserted stretch of road. Some bands extorted membership fees, promising safety only to abandon the traveler at the first sign of trouble. The narrator's tone is hushed but firm. In a world shaped by longing, vulnerability created an opening that the unscrupulous could slip through without remorse or hesitation. There were even tales of holy men, wandering hermits, dressed in rough wool, who appeared suddenly at crossroads, offering blessings or prophecies. Some were genuine mystics living in solitude, sustained by the kindness of pilgrims. Others were frauds, who learned the gestures of piety well enough to deceive the unwary. A blessing might cost a coin. A prophecy might require another. The stories vary, but one thread remains constant. Pilgrims desperately wanted signs that their dangerous journey had meaning. Those who understood this desire could manipulate it, weaving visions from imagination and selling reassurance to those trembling at the edge of destiny. Then there were the quiet criminals who drifted along the pilgrimage routes. Neither guides nor merchants, but watchers. They studied pilgrims' clothing, gait, accents, and pouches. They learned who carried offerings for shrines, who wore relics tied with silver thread, who had travelled alone for too long. These figures seldom acted during the day. Instead, they followed travellers at dusk, testing their fear with distant footsteps. Most pilgrims sensed these shadows, but could not distinguish threat from imagination. The night road made every noise suspect. A rustling branch, a distant cough, a whisper that might be prayer or danger. The narrator pauses to acknowledge the complexity of this world. Not all who sold relics knew they were false. Some believed wholeheartedly in the fragments they traded, having been deceived themselves. Not all guides with hidden motives sought cruelty. Some were driven by hunger, desperation, or fear of their own enemies. The pilgrimage landscape was a tapestry of overlapping motives: faith, survival, need, deceit. The same roads that carried the devout also carried those society pushed aside. To walk a pilgrimage route was to move through a world where intentions flickered like lantern flames, never entirely clear. Documented scandals intensified this uncertainty. Chronicles mention relics revealed as animal bones, props stolen from theatres, or objects hastily blessed to meet growing demand. Entire shrines were thrown into chaos when such discoveries came to light. Yet something remarkable often followed. Reports of miracles did not always cease. Pilgrims continued to claim healing, protection, or guidance, even after learning their precious relic was questionable. This paradox unsettles the narrator's tone, prompting an eerie question. Was faith doing the work? Were saints intervening despite the object's origin? Or did the object, fake as it was, tap into something real? The narrator suggests gently that belief itself contains a power not easily measured. A pilgrim who clung to a false relic during a storm might nonetheless walk with greater courage. A group guided by a deceptive leader might still reach safety because hope kept them moving. The boundary between falsehood and truth blurred in practice, creating a liminal space where intentions mattered more than material facts. For medieval people, sincerity shaped reality. A forged relic might still act as a vessel for earnest prayer. A dishonest guide might unwittingly lead someone toward a genuine miracle. The narrator begins with a slow, somber tone, guiding the viewer into the darker side of pilgrimage, the journeys that unraveled instead of resolving, the prayers that dissolved into silence, the travellers who stepped onto the night road and never returned. For every pilgrim who claimed healing or rescue, there were others whose stories ended abruptly, leaving behind only rumours and unease. Forgotten shoes found beside a ditch, packs discovered neatly arranged under a ruined tree, names whispered at winter hearths, always ending with the same refrain: they never reached the shrine. Such losses formed a shadowed counterpoint to miracle tales. Some vanishings were attributed to wolves or bandits. Others were blamed on rivers swollen after storms, or cliffs collapsing in heavy rain. Yet these explanations never fully satisfied villagers who'd watched a pilgrim depart with bright determination and never heard from them again. People wondered whether the road itself had judged them. Perhaps their sins were too heavy, their requests too bold, their intentions misguided. Medieval life was shaped by patterns, and when someone vanished outside those patterns, the mind sought meaning. Disappearance became more than tragedy. It became a sign, a hint that fate had closed its hand. The narrator lingers on scenes where pilgrims returned only to die shortly after arriving home, as though the journey had drained something vital. A man might step into his village, lean, sunburned, triumphant, claiming that he had touched the relic and felt a great peace, only to fall ill within days. A woman might limp through her own doorway after months away, whispering gratitude for surviving the road, then collapse by the hearth before finishing her story. Villagers stared at these quiet tragedies with heavy hearts. If the relic had not saved them, had the saint refused them? Whispers spread that some shrines had lost their favour. Places once known for glowing candles, sudden healings, or suspiciously lucky escapes began to feel dimmer. Miracles grew fewer. Stories of answered prayers became rare, replaced by murmurs of misfortune. A child struck ill after visiting. A traveller robbed just outside the church walls. A farmer who tripped on the steps and broke his leg so badly he never walked again. Locals said the saint had grown silent. That heaven's ear no longer bent toward this place. The relic still gleamed, but something behind it felt asleep. The narrator acknowledges how heavy such stories felt in medieval hearts. Pilgrims risked wolves, rivers, storms, and sickness for a chance, just a chance of bending fate. To discover that a shrine had gone quiet, that a relic no longer seemed to answer, was unbearable. Some insisted the problem lay not with the relic, but with the people visiting it. Perhaps too many pilgrims had asked selfishly. Perhaps false guides had tainted the road. Perhaps the world itself had shifted, leaving certain places stripped of grace. Silence bred theories, and theories bred fear. This fear deepened around roads that earned reputations for bad luck. Travellers whispered of certain stretches where prayers went unanswered, where lanterns sputtered without wind, where the night felt thick and watchful. Stories spread of pilgrims collapsing on those paths, struck by illness without warning, or turning back in tears, convinced something unseen walked beside them. Even experienced travellers avoided these places after dusk. A cursed road needed no official proclamation. Its reputation bloomed from fear retold at tavern tables, from the trembling voice of someone who'd barely crossed it without harm. The narrator offers an unsettling image, a lonely path winding through deep woods, known to locals as the Road of Returned Tears. Pilgrims who walked it seeking blessing often came back carrying loss instead. A father who prayed for his daughter's healing returned to find her gone. A young woman who begged for protection for her travelling brother learned he had been robbed miles away. The road became infamous for reversals petitions answered with their opposites. Whether coincidence or curse, villagers walked past the path with lowered eyes, offering small prayers of avoidance. Other shrines bore similar reputations. A chapel built near a marsh once attracted pilgrims for its rumoured healing spring. But after several drownings in mud, in sudden floods, in treacherous pools concealed by reeds, the spring was said to have turned against those who sought it. Locals believed the saint had withdrawn their blessing or never favoured the place at all. The chapel doors eventually rotted from neglect, and the relic within was moved elsewhere. Yet people continued telling stories of lantern lights flickering over the marsh on moonless nights, as though pilgrims long gone still groped for the lost grace. One account speaks of a relic whose favour seemed to reverse itself over time. Early visitors told of miraculous recoveries, of illnesses halted and lives spared. But decades later, pilgrims began reporting misfortunes following their visit. Livestock dying, storms destroying homes, children growing weak. Whether these stories came from envy, coincidence, or fear hardly mattered. Once a relic's reputation turned, it was nearly impossible to restore. A saint once thought gentle began to be spoken of in hushed tones, as though the benevolent protector had become a watcher whose silence bordered on warning. The narrator gently suggests that many of these tales sprang from grief rather than evidence. People needed explanations when hope failed. They needed meaning when hardship returned with sharpened teeth. A cursed road, a silent relic, or a shrine that lost its glow offered a framework for sorrow, a way to speak the unspeakable truth that sometimes prayers go unanswered. Yet superstitions clung to these explanations, deepening the emotional shadows around certain places. Travellers approached them with dread, convinced that stepping there might pull their thread of destiny tighter rather than loosen it. The narrator begins with a quiet chill, explaining that for all the comfort relics offered, some carried a reputation that made pilgrims hesitate before drawing near. These were not merely sacred fragments, but objects wrapped in stories of judgment, retaliation, or cold, watchful presence. Medieval people believed that saints were alive in their own way, alert to disrespect, sensitive to intentions. If relics could soften fate, they could also defend their dignity. The night pilgrim walking towards such an object felt not only awe, but scrutiny. Approaching a relic like this meant entering a space where consequences sharpened, unseen yet palpable. Tales of punished irreverence spread quickly across villages. One story tells of a man who attempted to steal a jeweled reliquary under cover of darkness. According to chroniclers, he tripped at the threshold and broke his ankle so badly he never walked straight again. Others said a sudden fever seized him before he left the church grounds. Whether these details were exaggerated hardly mattered. The story carried a warning. Relics were not simply treasures. Stealing one was believed to invite divine retribution. The saint behind the relic was imagined not as passive, but as a silent guardian. There were even stranger stories of skeptics who mocked a relic's power. A merchant, passing through a town famous for its healing shrine, reportedly scoffed loudly during a procession, calling it superstition. Hours later, he collapsed from an unexplained sickness that lingered for months. When he recovered, he returned to the shrine barefoot, seeking forgiveness. Was it coincidence? Illness? Guilt? To medieval minds, the answer was clear. The saint had measured his heart and found it lacking. The relic became not an object of comfort, but a reminder that humility was required in the presence of the sacred. The narrator then describes custodians who suffered misfortune after neglecting their duties. A monk assigned to guard a relic fell asleep one night, allowing smoke from nearby candles to darken the reliquary's glass. The next week, he lost a cherished book in a flood. Another caretaker forgot to lock the shrine properly and later broke his hand during mundane work. These stories reinforced a powerful belief. Relics noticed carelessness. They demanded respect. Their guardians felt watched, as if the saint expected vigilance as part of the sacred trust. Even minor accidents began to feel like warnings from beyond. The tone deepens as we move to more unsettling accounts. Some relics, villagers said, possessed a heavy presence, as though the saint behind them was stern or battle-worn. People approaching these objects reported sudden coldness, dizziness, or the unnerving sense of eyes studying them from within the reliquary. Pilgrims spoke of standing in line, waiting their turn, only to feel judged before they reached the front. Some stepped away without touching the relic at all, gripped by the fear that they had been quietly rejected. These were not common experiences, but memorable ones that darkened a shrine's reputation. A particularly haunting legend tells of a relic kept in a secluded mountain chapel. Those who approached it claimed their prayers echoed strangely inside their heads, as if repeated by another voice. A few reported feeling profound unworthiness, collapsing before the altar in tears. One woman claimed she saw her worst memory flash before her eyes as she reached toward the bone wrapped in crystal. Whether these visions were psychological, spiritual, or imagined, they shaped the relic's reputation. Pilgrims still visited, but cautiously, certain that the saint behind the object weighed each heart with unsettling precision. Added to this were tales of relics refusing to be moved. When clerics tried to relocate some objects to safer places, they encountered mysterious resistance. Carts breaking, porters falling ill, storms rising suddenly. Chroniclers recorded such events as signs that the saint wished to remain where they were. Attempts to force relocation sometimes resulted in misfortunes for the movers, fueling belief that relics possessed territorial will. Shrines built at these sites remained, not because of convenience, but because no one dared challenge the invisible authority that seemed to emanate from the relic's presence. The narrator pauses to reflect on why these stories mattered. Medieval people lived in a world where power both earthly and divine felt personal. Relics were not symbols, they were participants. When someone approached one with reverence, they expected attention. When someone approached with arrogance, they feared judgment. The relic became a kind of spiritual mirror, reflecting intentions back to the pilgrim in ways that could feel comforting or terrifying. This uncertainty animated the emotional landscape of pilgrimage. You never quite knew whether the saint behind the relic would grant mercy, issue warning, or remain silent altogether. There were also whispered accounts of relics that seemed to test pilgrims deliberately. A knight seeking forgiveness knelt before a relic for hours but felt nothing, no warmth, no clarity, no shift in fate. Days later, during battle, he claimed to hear a faint voice urging caution, saving his life when arrows rained unexpectedly. Another pilgrim, desperate for healing, felt ignored by a relic during his visit, but recovered months later without explanation. These stories suggested that relics acted according to mysterious timing, granting or withholding their influence in ways beyond human understanding. But the darkest stories spoke of relics that appeared actively hostile. A few shrines became infamous for misfortune clustering around them. A visitor would fall ill, another would lose their way home, another would suffer a crushing accident days later. People whispered that perhaps the saint was displeased with the world, or that the relic had absorbed too much sorrow, turning brittle and sharp like a broken shard. Some even wondered whether relics could trap grief or anger, holding the weight of generations until the burden spilled into the lives of those who approached unwisely. The narrator begins this final section with a slow and unsettling quiet, explaining that the fear surrounding cursed shrines and silent relics did not remain confined to individual tragedies. During times of famine, plague, or war, entire regions felt as if the saints themselves had withdrawn, leaving prayers to fall unanswered into a darkening sky. People living through these calamities wondered whether the world had entered a dangerous moment, a thinning of grace. If relics no longer healed or protected, what did that say about the times? The idea that history itself was shifting became impossible to ignore for them. The narrator explains that medieval people interpreted the failure of relics not as random misfortune, but as a sign that the cosmic order might be fracturing. When the familiar protections no longer held, when prayers returned unchanged, many believed the tapestry of time was loosening thread by thread. Preachers gave somber sermons describing a world slipping toward judgment, where saints could no longer shield humanity from the consequences of its collective sins. Some villagers reported visions of dark figures roaming ruined fields. Others heard rumors that angels wept above burning towns. Fear transformed every unexplained silence into an omen tonight. Pilgrims, traveling through such troubled landscapes, often felt an apocalyptic weight pressing on their shoulders. A road that once led to blessing now seemed like a corridor toward some final reckoning. The narrator describes travelers who walked not to seek a specific miracle, but to find refuge from a future they feared had already begun. In crowded inns and wind-beaten clearings, whispered conversations wondered whether saints were withdrawing because the world no longer deserved protection. Some believed relics would soon vanish, taken into heaven to signal the closing of an age. Others sensed darker forces stirring beneath the familiar earth. Rumors of relics disappearing before calamities spread along the roads like smoke in high wind. Some chronicles reported that a shrine's most cherished object had gone missing just weeks before famine struck or armies invaded. Whether stolen, hidden, or imagined, these vanishings became part of a belief that relics acted as warning beacons. When grace withdrew, danger soon followed. The narrator emphasizes how villagers interpreted these moments not as theft but as departure, a saint leaving their earthly post. If even holy guardians fled, what hope remained for ordinary people walking under an increasingly heavy sky on that fearful night now? Preachers responded with fiery urgency. Some declared that human sin had grown too vast for saints to counterbalance, that heaven's patience thinned like old parchment. Others preached gentler interpretations, suggesting saints remained present but hidden, waiting for repentance to reopen the channels of mercy. Yet both views encouraged fear. Pilgrims arriving at shrines felt a troubling uncertainty. Were they witnessing the world's unraveling or merely suffering its cyclical hardships? The narrator notes how these interpretations shaped daily life. Every storm seemed like prophecy, every omen a potential signal that something immense stirred beyond the fragile curtain of time for them. Terrified villagers sought meaning in patterns, weaving connections between distant tragedies and local misfortunes. A barn fire might be traced to the disappearance of a relic 2 towns away. A plague outbreak might be blamed on a cursed road no one had dared to bless. The narrator explains how this chain-link interpretation of events created a worldview where every loss folded into a larger narrative. People no longer suffered alone. They suffered as part of an age sliding toward crisis. Fear, once fragmented, gathered into a unified belief that history was tilting towards something dark and transformative for their world. Pilgrims walking through regions shaken by war or famine often carried this fear like a second burden. The narrator describes travelers who believed they were witnessing the early signs of an ending age. They walked not only to seek personal mercy, but to align themselves with the last remaining channels of grace. Some carried candles they vowed to light at the shrine, if the world survived another year. Others brought offerings wrapped with trembling hands. They felt that relics might serve as shields in the final struggle, or as anchors keeping remnants of divine order from disappearing entirely for them. Some chroniclers even recorded prophecies that relics would play a role at the end of time. A monk in Burgundy wrote of a vision in which relics rose from their reliquaries and led processions against encroaching darkness. Another text hinted that relics would vanish before the world ended, taken by angels to preserve the memory of grace. These stories, though rare, frightened listeners profoundly. If relics disappeared, what would remain to anchor the world? The narrator lets the viewer feel that dread. Relics were not only memories of the past, they were safeguards for a future trembling on the edge. Through all these fears, the night pilgrim continued to walk, lantern trembling, breath rising in pale clouds. He knew the world felt unstable, yet he could not abandon his plea. The narrator shows him pausing at a fork, where one road held a reputation for curses. He chooses the safer path, though fear whispers that no road is truly safe now. Around him, the forest feels watchful, the wind heavy with unspoken warnings. And yet he walks, trusting that even in uncertain times, saints hear those who approach with humility and trembling hope for protection on that long, cold night. In the final moments of this section, the narrator turns toward the horizon of belief itself. If relics could protect or curse, speak or fall silent, vanish or remain defiantly rooted, what did that mean for a world teetering between dread and longing? Medieval people lived with the sense that history moved in great cycles, rising and collapsing like breath. The pilgrim walking alone believed his journey mattered within that vast movement. And as whispers spread that relics might vanish before the world's end, he felt the urgency sharpen. His steps carried not only prayer but preparation for the unknown. The narrator begins with a low, steady calm, easing the viewer into the grand horizon of medieval imagination. In that age, many believed the world was old, ancient beyond comprehension, and drawing near to its final chapters. Time felt weighted, as if the great story begun in Genesis had grown thin in its later pages. Signs in the sky were read as warnings: blood-red moons, wandering stars, halos around the sun, strange seasons frightened farmers, frost in summer, storms in winter, harvests that shriveled where they stood. These were not merely weather patterns, they were messages, urgent and uncomfortably clear. Life in medieval Europe unfolded with an ever-present sense that history moved toward a fixed conclusion. Sermons spoke of the coming judgment, reminding people that kingdoms rose and fell under God's watchful eye. Chroniclers described moral decay, greed, violence, pride, as proof that humanity had strayed too far. Villagers whispered that wars were multiplying, that plagues lasted longer, that darkness felt heavier than before. Even ordinary events took on cosmic significance. A comet streaking overhead might send entire towns to their knees, praying for mercy. People felt their era trembling, as if standing on the edge of an unseen precipice tonight. For pilgrims walking night roads, this belief in an aging, fragile world shaped every step. They did not merely fear wolves or thieves, they feared history itself. The narrator describes pilgrims who believed their lives were unfolding in a moment of global instability. Time felt frayed, loose at the edges, its threads slipping. A pilgrimage became not only an appeal for personal blessing, but an attempt to anchor oneself before the world crossed a threshold. To walk toward a relic was to walk toward one of the last steady points in a shifting landscape. Shrines during times of crisis became crowded beyond imagining. People stood shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering candles, waiting for a glimpse of the relic that might protect them from what they could not name. Some carried children, others carried scars. Fear had a strange unifying force. It gathered people together, turning towns into clusters of trembling hope. Pilgrims arrived exhausted, starving, barefoot, driven by rumors of miracles or visions. The narrator lingers on this image. Thousands of individuals pressing toward the same point, desperate for reassurance that the world still held mercy, that heaven had not closed its doors. The atmosphere around these shrines felt charged, almost electric. Every cough, every whispered prayer, every flicker of candlelight seemed to carry symbolic weight. People believed that their collective fear might awaken the attention of saints. If enough voices rose, perhaps catastrophe could be paused, softened, or delayed. Medieval chronicles describe feast days during famine, when crowds grew so large that streets became rivers of bodies, pushing forward not with joy but with apprehension. The narrator notes that in such moments, pilgrims were not only asking for personal healing, they were asking the world to keep turning. And then comes the subtle suggestion that forms the engagement spike. Some pilgrims felt they were participating in a ritual meant to stretch time itself. If the world was nearing its end, perhaps devotion could slow the unraveling. Perhaps relics, touched and venerated by thousands, could act as anchors holding up the last beams of a weakening sky. Such thoughts were not widespread doctrine, yet they fluttered through anxious hearts. A pilgrim kneeling before a relic might think, "Let this protect not just me, but all of us." The narrator lets this idea hover like smoke in cold air. Night pilgrims, in particular, felt this pressure intensely. They walked when others slept, carrying fears too heavy for daylight. The world at night seemed thinner, quieter, easier to break. These travelers saw themselves as walkers at the edge of an age, pressing onward not only for their own sake but for the fragile world trembling behind them. A lantern's glow became a symbol of defiance, a single flame against the vastness of history. Each footstep echoed the unspoken question. If time is truly running out, what else is left except prayer, travel, and hope? The narrator describes one such pilgrim, a young man whose village had been shattered by famine. He believed he lived in a final chapter, yet instead of collapsing under despair, he chose to walk. His journey was not for personal gain, but for protection of those who remained at home. He carried a scrap of cloth tied around his wrist, said to have touched the reliquary of a local saint. With each step, he whispered, "Hold the world together a little longer." His fear did not slow him. Instead, it gave him purpose, lighting the path ahead like a fragile spark. Crowded shrines in troubled years sometimes resembled refugee camps. People lingered for days, unwilling to leave the faint safety offered by sacred walls. Priests worked tirelessly, blessing pilgrims until their voices cracked. Relics were paraded through the streets as the air filled with incense and panic. The narrator paints the scene with soft dread, banners trembling in the wind, children clinging to their mothers, the old watching the horizon as if expecting fire. The relic itself, housed in gold or bone or crystal, became a focal point of collective will, a final bulwark against a collapsing age. For many, the pilgrimage was a kind of insurance against the end. If history was fraying, perhaps heaven would spare those who sought connection. Pilgrims prayed for their families, their villages, their kingdoms. But some whispered broader pleas: "Spare the world, give us more time." These were not formal prayers found in books. They rose from the raw fear that everything familiar might soon vanish. The narrator notes that medieval people rarely framed these anxieties as philosophical questions. They expressed them through action: walking roads, lighting candles, touching relics, performing acts of devotion meant to steady the trembling fabric of time. The narrator begins gently, inviting the viewer deeper into the strange, symbolic architecture of the medieval imagination. If pilgrims on night roads walked toward relics for personal hope, some also believed these sacred fragments served a larger purpose, holding the world together. In sermons, poems, and whispered tales, saints were sometimes described as pillars, supporting creation beings whose holiness upheld what sin threatened to unravel. Their relics, then, became physical reminders of that cosmic scaffolding. Touching a relic was not only seeking a favor, it was reaching for part of the structure that kept the sky from falling. This idea appears subtly in medieval writings, often wrapped in metaphor. Chroniclers described saints whose prayers held back the storm of the age, or whose presence kept kingdoms from collapse. When these saints died, their bones were believed to retain a trace of that stabilizing force. A relic in a church was not simply a memory, it was a point where divine strength touched the fragile web of history. The narrator lingers on this thought, letting it sink in. For people who felt time fraying around them, relics were more than hope, they were anchors driven into the shifting ground. Rituals performed for the realm grew out of this belief. When invaders marched toward a kingdom, clerics carried relics to city walls, asking the saint to push danger back. During plague years, relics were paraded around towns in solemn circuits, creating invisible boundaries meant to keep sickness from crossing. Some relics were stationed at town gates, their presence a spiritual fortification. The narrator's voice softens as candles and incense swirl around these images, describing how villagers watched the rituals with trembling breath, convinced that bones carried in golden boxes held more power than armies or walls. These public ceremonies felt like more than prayer. They felt like reinforcement, strengthening weak points in the world's fabric. People believed relics could influence winds, seasons, or even the intentions of powerful men. A king blessed before a relic might hesitate to wage an unjust war. A storm threatening a harvest might shift direction after a relic procession. These moments, whether coincidence or miracle, encouraged the idea that relics served as stabilizing nodes throughout Europe. The world, in this view, was a tapestry stretched between holy anchors. If one anchor broke or moved, the cloth sagged in unpredictable ways. The engagement spike arrives when the narrator notes that some medieval writers seem to treat relics as literal stakes pinning time in place. One monk wrote that a certain saint's relic held the sun in its course. Another claimed that a relic removed from his region caused 3 years of disorder. Such statements might strike modern ears as exaggerations, but they reflected a worldview where spiritual and temporal stability intertwined completely. The relic did not merely protect individuals, it steadied eras. Losing one meant part of the world's structure weakened, like removing a beam from a tired ceiling. Fear of losing relics was therefore intense. During wars, towns hid their relics underground or carried them into mountains, believing that if the sacred object were captured or destroyed, catastrophe would follow. Some even claimed that disasters proved relics had been mishandled or misplaced. When a relic vanished, whether stolen, relocated, or concealed by clergy, it sparked widespread anxiety. People wondered if the saint had abandoned them or if the world had tilted into a dangerous chapter. The narrator lingers on these fears, showing how relics mapped not only geography but temporal stability. Pilgrimage routes themselves were sometimes seen as lines of spiritual reinforcement. A road walked by, thousands of faithful feet became a channel through which blessings flowed, like veins carrying lifeblood across a continent. Shrines positioned along these routes acted as pressure points. If enough footsteps strung them together, they formed a network of sacred presence holding back encroaching darkness. Medieval maps, the narrator explains, do not show this network directly, but one can feel it in the patterns of shrines and chapels, like constellations drawn across the earth, each point reinforcing the others. During times of crisis, some regions expanded these networks deliberately. New chapels were built, relics were exchanged between towns to strengthen bonds. Processions were scheduled across multiple villages to form spiritual chains. When famine struck or enemies approached, clergy spoke of raising a wall of prayer. This phrase carried more than poetic meaning. People believed they were adding stitches to the world's unraveling tapestry. A pilgrim walking along a route during these coordinated rituals felt they were part of something vast, a collective effort to delay catastrophe through devotion, endurance, and the physical presence of relics. The narrator shares a haunting example. A relic of a martyr once moved between 3 towns each year, following a strict rotation believed to maintain balance in the region. If the relic remained too long in one place, storms would worsen or livestock would fall ill. Whether these patterns reflected superstition or natural cycles, villagers trusted the rhythm deeply. The movement of the relic became a kind of temporal maintenance. When war disrupted the cycle one year, people panicked. They believed the timeline might fray without its stabilizing circuit. Fear spread like frost through fields that already bore too much grief. Another tale describes a relic procession arranged after a devastating earthquake. Clerics marched with the relic held high, circling the ruined city as aftershocks trembled beneath their feet. According to chronicle entries, the tremors ceased as the relic returned to its shrine. Whether true or embellished, such stories revealed how people perceived relics as tools for repairing reality. A relic did not simply soothe hearts, it smoothed the jagged edges of time, restoring order where chaos threatened. The narrator emphasizes that even skeptics felt a sense of relief during these rituals, as if the relic's presence steadied something deep within them. The narrator opens this section with a drifting calm, guiding the viewer into a landscape where history blurs into memory. As centuries passed, many shrines declined, were destroyed, or simply forgotten, leaving behind scattered echoes of devotion woven into the countryside. Roads, once trodden by desperate pilgrims, faded beneath forests and farmland, yet whispers clung to them like mist. Travelers spoke of hidden chapels buried under ivy, wells that once granted visions to the faithful, and crosses standing alone beside ancient ditches. Even ruined foundations seemed to hum with stories, as if the land itself remembered what people had lost. Some believed these forgotten places still held faint power, like coals glowing under ash. Villagers told stories of travelers stumbling upon moss-covered stones that felt strangely warm, or hearing distant chanting near abandoned ruins at dusk. The narrator explains that such tales blurred the line between faith and folklore. People wondered whether relics removed during wars or reforms had been secretly reburied, waiting for an age desperate enough to seek them again. A lonely chapel half collapsed into brambles might have once anchored a community's hope. Even lost milestones chipped by weather carried symbols no one remembered how to read today. Over centuries, shifting borders and vanished villages created pockets of mystery. A field that now seems ordinary might have been a gathering place for midnight vigils. A quiet hill might hide the remnants of a shrine burned in some forgotten conflict. The narrator lingers on these transformations, showing how the ground remembers what human memory lets go. Medieval roads, once connecting vital shrines, faded into faint depressions in grass. Streams redirected by storms erased crossings where pilgrims prayed for guidance. Yet something about these sites continues to draw wanderers, as if the landscape whispers hints of dormant, half-buried sanctity still. Some legends claim certain relics were hidden deliberately. When raids threatened, clergy buried precious bones in glens, forests, or riverbanks, leaving only cryptic markers behind. Many died before retrieving them, and the knowledge dissolved into time. The narrator describes how these tales fueled centuries of searching. Farmers ploughing fields found carved stones no one could explain. Shepherds discovered rusted hinges deep in the hills. Travelers reported dreams directing them toward forgotten ruins. Whether these signs meant anything objectively mattered less than the belief they awakened. People felt the past reaching forward, inviting them to uncover what had been protected there. In some regions, folklore spoke of roads that changed their character as centuries passed. A path once blessed by a saint might later be feared for misfortune. Another, that once carried relic processions, became overgrown and whispering. The narrator explains that these shifting reputations reveal how memory drifts through landscapes like migrating birds. Even when physical traces vanish, stories cling to the soil. A bend in a forest path may feel heavy with unseen watching, not because anything remains, but because countless footsteps once pressed prayers into the earth. The land absorbs longing, fear, and hope like water sinking deep. Forgotten shrines sometimes re-entered local memory through strange encounters. Travelers reported hearing bells with no visible source, or seeing candles flicker in ruins long abandoned. A shepherd might discover a patch of ground unnaturally warm in winter, later learning the site had once held a relic. The narrator highlights how these stories blurred boundaries between history and haunting. People believed the landscape could echo with spiritual residue, like a room retaining incense long after the smoke fades. Even when saints' bones were moved or destroyed, something remained: a quiet pressure, a sense of being observed by memory itself in the dusk. Some modern hikers stumble upon these places without realizing their significance. A broken arch in a forest may look like a simple ruin, yet once framed a relic procession. A shallow well tucked behind reeds might have served as a visionary site. The narrator draws parallels between past and present, suggesting that landscapes retain emotional fingerprints. Even without context, sensitive visitors feel a shift in atmosphere, a hush, a heaviness, or a sudden clarity. These reactions mirror those of medieval pilgrims, bridging centuries. The land does not explain itself, it only waits, carrying memories like embers under settling ash for now. Folklore grew around these forgotten nodes. Children were warned not to linger near certain stones. Adults avoided particular bends in the road after dark. Some said these sites absorbed the unanswered prayers of those who once walked there, creating pockets of restless longing. Others believed hidden relics still slept beneath the soil, their presence altering the air. The narrator explains that these tales acted as bridges between generations, preserving fragments of lost pilgrimage routes. Even when history forgot the details, stories remained, forming a ghost map of sacred geography stretching beneath the surface of everyday life for those who still wander. The narrator suggests the landscape itself may hold the last traces of medieval attempts to bend fate. Old stones marked with worn symbols could represent stations where desperate pleas once rose into cold night air. A fallen tree concealing a hollow might hide remnants of offerings left centuries ago. The world has shifted, but its deeper layers remain. People now walk dogs or hike trails where pilgrims once wept, bargained, and begged. Without realizing it, modern feet retrace ancient patterns. The narrator lets this thought settle like dusk light. The land remembers, even when human memory fades to echo now. As this section closes, the narrator returns to the lone night traveler. He walks through a countryside layered with forgotten shrines, hidden relics, and stories buried so deep that only the land remembers them. Every step he takes follows someone's old desperation, someone's hope carved into earth centuries before. He will never know the names of those who walked here first, or the prayers they whispered, or the destinies they tried to unravel. Yet the landscape holds their shadows. It cradles them gently, offering guidance to those who listen. And thus the path continues, half seen, half remembered by all. The narrator opens softly, drawing the viewer from medieval night roads into the dim corridors of our own time. Though centuries have passed, the human instinct to seek meaning in dark hours has not faded. Today, people still travel, sometimes across continents to shrines and holy springs, sometimes only across a city to stand beneath stained glass or touch an ancient stone that thousands have touched before. They carry photographs tucked inside pockets, folded letters, small objects belonging to those they desperately hope will be healed or forgiven. Their steps echo those of travelers who once walked by lantern through forests, whispering with wolves. Modern pilgrims approach these places quietly, sometimes embarrassed by the depth of their hope. In the glow of votive candles, they whisper names of parents, children, lovers, or lost friends. Some bring offerings, flowers, coins, written notes. Others simply stand still, waiting for a feeling, an inner tilt, a subtle warmth, a sense that someone or something is listening. If the relics housed inside these shrines belong to saints whose stories stretch across centuries, the visitors who kneel before them now bring the same ancient desires: healing, guidance, protection, forgiveness, and courage to face the uncertain path ahead. But the narrator gently widens the frame to include those who do not travel physically. They walk different kinds of roads, city streets lit by sodium lamps, quiet parks at midnight, narrow alleys where their footsteps echo against bricks. Some walk to think, some walk to escape their own thoughts. Others walk simply because home feels too small for the weight they carry. Earbuds in, hood up, they drift through the night accompanied by voices from podcasts about conspiracies, mysteries, ancient puzzles, or forbidden histories. The glow of a phone illuminates their hands like a lantern illuminating a medieval road. The narrator lingers on this parallel. Night walkers now move through man-made canyons instead of forests. But the feeling is the same. The world is quieter, drained of witnesses. Streetlights flicker like torches on distant hills. The hum of the city becomes a kind of chant. The digital world, accessed through a device held close to the chest, becomes a shrine of its own, filled not with bones, but with stories, warnings, revelations, and secrets. Modern pilgrims do not always know they are pilgrims, yet they walk through the dark seeking something they cannot name, something that feels like truth. The narrator describes someone scrolling through forgotten corners of the internet at 2 a.m. They sit alone in a room lit only by the shifting glow of their screen. Outside, a bus sighs at a stop. A dog barks. The world is quiet, except for the flicker of digital stories unfolding like ancient manuscripts. They read about strange lights seen in forests, about hidden tunnels beneath old cities, about miracles whispered but never confirmed. Their pulse quickens not from fear, but from recognition. Something in these stories mirrors the longing inside them, the desire to be seen by forces larger than themselves. Many people, the narrator suggests, return night after night to these digital spaces because they feel the same mix of hope and dread that drew medieval pilgrims to relics. A video might promise secret knowledge. A forum might feel like a congregation of the curious. A podcast voice might steady nerves trembling from loneliness or uncertainty. And while no relic sits on an altar, there remains the sense that certain accounts, channels, or archives hold something powerful, something that might shift how a person sees their future, their purpose, or the hidden architecture of the world. In this way, digital spaces become modern reliquaries, not sacred in the theological sense, but sacred in the emotional one. The narrator paints the image delicately, an archive of old posts, functioning like a chest of holy fragments, a playlist of long-form mysteries, acting like a corridor of ancient paintings, a saved video becoming a devotional object replayed during sleepless nights. Viewers do not bow, but their attention bows. They treat these digital relics with reverence, saving, sharing, returning to them as if they hold a key, a clue, or a fragile piece of fate waiting to be understood. The engagement spike arrives here. Perhaps the viewer themselves has such digital relics. Old voice messages they cannot delete, screenshots of moments that mattered, bookmarks saved for reasons they barely recall. The narrator asks with soft inevitability, are these not modern charms, carried around the way pilgrims once carried tiny relics sewn into their clothing? Do they not shape decisions, emotions, even the trajectory of a life? A message from years ago might influence a choice today. A picture might stop someone from giving up. Digital relics bend time in their own way, pulling past and present into the same trembling moment. And as the narrator deepens this idea, the viewer may feel a slight shiver. Perhaps the modern world still has its own pilgrimage routes, only now they run through servers, feeds, and videos that appear on recommended lists like signposts, lit by flickering lamps. People gather around certain creators, the way crowds once gathered around shrines. They search for answers in comments and threads. They whisper their fears into search bars instead of into chapel walls. The desire is unchanged. What matters is not the medium, but the longing, the same ancient longing to be guided through the darkness. The narrator then returns the viewer gently to themselves. They, too, are a night pilgrim of sorts. They, too, walk roads physical or digital, seeking understanding when the world feels unsteady. Their phone's glow is their lantern. Their saved posts and bookmarked stories are their relics. Their late-night viewing is their vigil. And just as medieval travelers once walked beside strangers in darkness, the viewer now sits in quiet companionship with millions of others who watch, listen, and search for meaning after midnight. The roads have changed. The relics have changed. But the night pilgrim endures. The narrator begins gently, inviting the viewer to look inward rather than outward, to consider not ancient bones or gilded shrines, but the quiet archives they carry inside their devices. In the medieval world, relics were fragments of lives once lived, pieces of time made tangible. Today, we still keep such fragments, but they exist as pixels, recordings, saved messages, and scanned photographs. They do not rest in golden boxes. They sit in folders labeled favorites, memories, voice notes, or do not delete. Yet they carry the same emotional gravity. Each digital relic holds a past moment still humming softly with meaning. The narrator paints a familiar scene. A person sitting awake at 3 a.m., staring at an old conversation on their phone. The messages were exchanged with someone now gone, someone who moved away, drifted apart, or passed from this world. Reading their words brings the past close, collapsing years into seconds. The viewer can feel this, because everyone carries such small digital reliquaries. A saved voicemail from a friend who died too young. A screenshot of something beautiful said during a better year. A video of a birthday now impossible to repeat. These fragments bend time, pulling yesterday into now. People revisit these digital relics, not only out of nostalgia, but out of longing. At night especially, they search for reassurance in old words, trying to feel again the warmth they once knew. The narrator compares this to medieval pilgrims who traveled to shrines seeking connection with saints who had witnessed suffering and survived it. Modern seekers approach their digital relics for similar reasons. A kind message from years ago might give someone strength to endure a difficult night. A saved photograph might remind them of who they were before life hardened around them. Memory becomes a form of intercession. The narrator leans further into this parallel, noting that many people treat certain files with almost sacred caution. There are photos they will not delete, even when storage runs low. There are texts they scroll past without opening, because the act feels too vulnerable. There are recordings they play only when alone, as if they contain something fragile and holy. These digital relics serve the same purpose. Medieval relics once did, grounding a person in meaning, offering comfort, shaping decisions. A single saved message can change a choice. A single memory can redirect a life's trajectory. Night after night, people return to these archives because they feel that something inside them, some fragment of strength or clarity, remains accessible only through these saved pieces of the past. The narrator gives a simple example. A tired person on the verge of giving up plays an old voice note from their mother, telling them to keep going. Another listens to a recording of a laugh they haven't heard in years. Another reads a message from someone who believed in them. These relics work quietly, stitching frayed edges of the present back into place. They are not miracles, but they feel like them. Then the narrator introduces the engagement spike, not with fear but with a quiet realization. We are not the only keepers of these digital relics. They live on servers we have never seen, in systems we did not build, controlled by companies we barely understand. Our memories exist in machines that store them, replicate them, back them up, or erase them without our knowledge. Algorithms decide which old photos to resurface. Apps remind us of, on this day, moments whether we want them or not. A digital relic can reappear suddenly, like a ghost tapping on the shoulder of the present. The narrator lets this idea settle. If medieval relics were guarded by priests and abbots, modern relics are guarded by platforms, cloud storage systems, and automated processes. They decide what remains visible, what is buried, what resurfaces at inopportune times. A server outage can swallow years of messages. An account locked behind forgotten passwords can trap essential memories out of reach. The narrator asks, does this not resemble gatekeeping? Are the guardians of our past now faceless networks and lines of code determining which fragments of ourselves remain accessible and which disappear into silent digital vaults? This realization stirs unease. People often assume their digital relics are secure because they are intangible. But in truth, they are vulnerable to deletion, obsolescence, corporate decisions, or even simple neglect. Just as relics in medieval shrines could be stolen, moved, or lost, modern relics drift through systems far beyond our control. The narrator describes someone frantically searching for an old email that once gave them courage, only to discover it was deleted in a routine cleanup. Their grief mirrors that of medieval pilgrims arriving at a shrine, only to find the relic moved or locked away. Yet there is another layer the narrator emphasizes. These digital relics shape not only individual fate but collective experience. A video, shared widely, can spark movements. A leaked message can alter public opinion. A preserved thread on a forum can influence thousands of people's beliefs about their future. In this way, digital relics become powerful communal objects, much like medieval relics that drew crowds to shrines. They gather emotional weight, guiding decisions not only for one person but for entire groups, hungry for meaning in a fractured era. The narrator returns to the solitary viewer, alone at night, scrolling through old pictures or saved notes. They are not searching for answers in ancient manuscripts. They are searching in folders named after dates and devices. Yet the yearning is the same. They want to feel anchored in a world that moves too quickly. They want reassurance that someone once cared for them, believed in them, or shared something precious with them. These digital relics serve as small anchors in a turbulent era, tiny stabilizing points scattered across the landscape of memory. The narrator begins softly, almost in a whisper, inviting the viewer into the quietest and most vulnerable room in the entire documentary, the interior world of their own longings. The medieval pilgrim walked the night road, believing the story of the world could shift, that fate might bend if approached at the right moment and in the right spirit. Today, people feel a similar pull, not toward relics or monasteries, but toward ideas of resets, fresh timelines, and secret mechanisms that might loosen the threads of an overwhelming life. The longing is the same, a desire to escape a pattern that feels inescapable. The narrator guides us gently into that feeling, describing how many modern people live caught between exhaustion and possibility. They wake with the sense that the world is spinning too fast, that circumstances have grown too heavy, or that invisible systems determine their days more than their own choices do. At night, especially late at night, these thoughts sharpen. People browse articles about economic collapse, watch videos about hidden histories, or explore theories about timelines being rewritten. Their curiosity is not madness. It is a quiet attempt to understand whether change is still possible, whether the future is negotiable. The narrator turns reflective, acknowledging that personal resets are often born from moments of intense pressure. A person overwhelmed by work might quit suddenly and begin again. Someone surviving heartbreak might move across the country. Another might end a toxic friendship or start a career no one expected of them. These actions can feel reckless, but beneath them lies a powerful truth. People have always believed they could step outside their current path. Medieval pilgrims left farms, families, and obligations to seek miracles. Modern pilgrims leave digital footprints behind as they search for new chapters of their own. Then the narrator offers the emotional spike. Whether we realize it or not, we have all already changed our timelines. Every life contains moments where something shattered quietly, an expectation, a relationship, a belief, and a new path formed out of necessity. A job lost but followed by a better one. A night of despair that yielded, inexplicably, to morning hope. A sudden insight that altered an entire future. These are the small edits of destiny that modern people rarely recognize. But the narrator suggests that these moments mirror the interventions medieval travelers begged for, subtle shifts in direction that feel almost miraculous in hindsight. The narrator expands this thought, reminding the viewer that even the worst nights of their life eventually gave way. A night when they cried until their ribs ached. A night when they thought they would never escape their circumstances. A night when the future seemed carved into stone. Yet morning always came, proving that time is never as fixed as it feels. Even when no saint intervened, something changed, whether inside them or around them. This resilience, this mysterious endurance, is its own kind of miracle. And perhaps, the narrator suggests, it is proof that timelines bend more often than we think. The camera drifts through images of people starting over, someone packing belongings into a single suitcase, someone deleting old messages, someone sitting at a train window watching their old life disappear behind passing lights. These quiet pilgrimages lack medieval landmarks but carry the same emotional weight. Modern seekers walk toward a future they hope will be kinder, rearranging their fate not through relics or shrines, but through difficult, brave decisions. The narrator lets these images unfold slowly, reminding the viewer that every reset begins with a single step into uncertainty, just like the pilgrim on the night road. Then comes the narrator's most intimate reflection. Modern people are haunted by recordings of their past. Digital relics preserve voices they no longer hear in daily life, faces they no longer see, and versions of themselves they have outgrown. These memories can comfort, but they also trap. A person longing for a reset must decide which memories to keep and which to release. The narrator describes someone staring at an old photograph, unsure whether it is an anchor or a chain. Medieval pilgrims faced similar conflicts, whether to cling to home or walk toward the unknown. The emotional struggle is timeless. The narrator deepens the parallel. Just as medieval pilgrims wondered whether their prayers might disturb the delicate balance of destiny, modern seekers fear that drastic change might harm those around them. Leaving a job could disrupt a family. Ending a relationship could wound someone deeply. Starting a new life could mean abandoning old responsibilities. These hesitations echo the ancient fear that asking too much from fate might ripple outward. Yet sometimes the cost of not changing is far greater. A stagnating life quietly erodes the soul, and stepping into a new chapter becomes necessary for survival. The narrator recounts stories of people who changed their lives only to discover meaning they had not known they were missing. Someone who moved far away found a passion they never imagined. Someone who ended a long relationship discovered a strength they had forgotten. Someone who left a collapsing career uncovered unexpected purpose in a completely different path. These are not miracles in the medieval sense, but they feel miraculous to the ones living them. They are proof that resets are possible not as cosmic interventions, but as acts of courage fueled by longing. And then, the narrator returns to the viewer, reminding them that they, too, have already survived turning points that seemed impossible. They have endured nights that should have broken them. They have made choices that altered the shape of their days. They have stepped into new timelines, even if they did not call them that. These moments of reinvention form a chain stretching back through their entire life, each link a quiet testimony that fate can be softened, redirected, or rewritten not through rituals alone, but through the determination to keep moving forward. The narrator brings us back to the beginning, back to the pilgrim we have followed through whispers, shadows, forests, and fears. Only now, the road beneath his feet feels thinner, almost brittle with exhaustion. His steps are uneven. His boots, once sturdy, have split at the seams. Blisters burn beneath damp cloth. The night is colder than any he has walked through so far, and every breath seems to tremble in the air before disappearing into darkness. His lantern gives off a faint, faltering glow, its oil nearly gone, its flame swaying as though unsure it can hold on. The narrator moves close, letting us hear the pilgrim's thoughts as they flicker through his mind like sparks in dying embers. He thinks of his family's faces, his mother praying beside a hearth, his brother coughing through long winter nights, the friend he buried last spring with trembling hands. He thinks of the promise he made as he stepped onto this road. Asterisk. If I return, I will be better. I will mend what I have broken. Asterisk. These thoughts steady him, even as the muscles in his legs tremble. Fear and hope twist together, pushing him forward through this final stretch. The road narrows, hemmed in by thick hedges that cast tangled shadows across his path. Dew beads on his cloak, soaking through the fabric until it clings heavily to his shoulders. Every sound is amplified: the distant hoot of an owl, the brittle snap of a twig, the faint sigh of wind from the valley below. The narrator explains that after so many miles walked in fear, the pilgrim now battles a deeper, quieter terror, the terror of reaching the end. What if the shrine is locked? What if the relic has been moved? What if he is too late for whatever mercy he seeks? He rounds a bend, and for the first time sees a slight shift in the darkness ahead, a shape too still to be part of the night, too straight to be a tree. The outline of a small church emerges faintly, its roof catching the dim light of the fading moon. His heart races, not with relief but with the trembling uncertainty of a dream finally nearing its waking moment. The narrator lets us feel his hesitation. The church seems impossibly far and painfully close, like a memory he has carried so long he is afraid to see it become real. Each step toward the shrine grows heavier, as though the road itself resists him, knowing that this is the moment where hope and truth must meet. He imagines the relic inside, wrapped in gold or cloth, waiting behind a grate or glass. He imagines kneeling before it, whispering his plea with cracked lips. But he also imagines reaching the door only to find darkness and silence, the relic gone, the saint unmoved. The narrator traces these fears with gentle precision, acknowledging that this is where every pilgrimage becomes fragile. Faith is strongest just before it breaks. The pilgrim pauses at the edge of the churchyard, breathing deeply as the scent of cold stone drifts toward him. A faint sound trembles on the air, chanting, bells, or merely the wind pulling through the chapel's narrow windows. For a moment, he cannot tell. His lantern flickers, then steadies itself weakly. He steps through the gate, which creaks louder than seems possible in the stillness. His heart thunders. The entire journey has tightened into this single breath. His thoughts race. Asterisk. What if the saint refuses me? What if I have not walked purely enough? What if fate is already set? Asterisk. The narrator describes the pilgrim's approach to the door with slow, deliberate detail. His hand shakes as he lifts it toward the wood. The texture feels rough and cold beneath his fingertips. He thinks of the prayers he whispered into the night, the tears he hid behind tree trunks when fear threatened to overwhelm him, the dangers he narrowly escaped, each one a step in a plea he hoped heaven was listening to. Every mile behind him now presses into this single trembling question. Asterisk. Will this journey matter? Asterisk. Or has the script of his life already been written beyond negotiation? He closes his eyes and leans his forehead against the door. For a moment, everything becomes silent, his breath, the wind, even the distant owl calls. The narrator lets this silence linger. It is the silence of someone who has finally reached the place where fear and longing merge. He feels the weight of his own life pressing against the wooden boards. He knows the relic might not change the future. He knows saints may not bend fate for him, and yet he also knows he cannot turn back. Not now. Not after surviving the long dark and carrying so many fragile hopes. His fingers curl around the iron handle. It is colder than he expected, sending a shiver through his arm. He hesitates not because he doubts his need, but because he knows that once he opens this door, something in him will change forever. The narrator explains that every pilgrim faces this moment, the threshold where effort ends and vulnerability begins. Opening the door is an act of surrender. It is the moment where a human being, stripped of excuses and armor, presents themselves fully before mystery. Whether they find miracle or silence, they cannot hide from what waits inside. Finally, with a slow, shaking breath, he pushes. The door groans open, releasing a soft exhale of warm, incense-scented air. Candlelight flickers along the stone floor, stretching thin shadows up the walls. The chanting he thought he heard dissolves. There are no voices inside, only the quiet pulse of flame after flame burning steadily in the dark. His lantern fades entirely now, its light unnecessary. The pilgrim steps forward, crossing the final threshold. The narrator lets the moment hover. This is the end of his road, the place where fear, hope, prayer, and exhaustion gather into one trembling step forward. The pilgrim steps deeper into the chapel, letting the door fall shut behind him with a soft wooden sigh. The sound seems impossibly loud in the small sanctuary, echoing off stone walls darkened by centuries of candle soot. His breath comes in slow, uneven pulls as he stands motionless, letting the stillness settle around him. The air is warmer than the night outside, thick with old incense, wax, and something faintly metallic like the ghost of long-dried tears. With each blink, his vision sharpens, revealing rows of candles flickering like a small constellation arranged along the edges of the altar. He takes another step, and the floor answers with a whispering creak, as if acknowledging another weary soul joining the countless who have knelt here before. The narrator's voice slows to match his pace, noting how every detail inside the shrine seems softened by time. The worn stones underfoot, the frayed edges of a tapestry depicting a saint's life, the faded colours of painted saints watching from the walls. Nothing here is spectacular. Everything is fragile. And somehow, that smallness feels more sacred than gold or grandeur ever could on this quiet night. The reliquary itself waits at the centre of the altar, modest, unassuming, barely larger than a traveller's satchel. Its wooden frame gleams faintly where candlelight touches it, revealing delicate carvings of vines and stars. Glass panels reflect the room like small pools of water. The pilgrim is almost startled by its simplicity. After all his miles imagining it as a radiant, world-shaking object, he finds instead something small enough to fit between his palms. The narrator lets that contrast sit gently. Real power, in both past and present, often arrives smaller than the stories built around it. His legs tremble as he approaches the altar. Fatigue drags at his bones, but awe lifts him forward. When he finally drops to his knees, the cold rush of stone floods upward through his body. His cloak pulls around him, heavy with dew and dirt gathered from every mile of the journey. He places his hands on the ground, fingers spread as if to steady himself against emotion that threatens to unbalance him. His forehead meets the stone next, and for a moment he simply stays folded like that, silent, breathing in the scent of ancient dust and fading incense. His mind, which had spun in frantic circles along the dark road, begins to slow. The narrator describes how thoughts rise and fall inside him like waves: fear for the person he came here for, regret for unkind words spoken months ago, guilt for choices he cannot take back. These thoughts don't vanish, they don't soften, they simply settle into a place he can finally look at them without flinching. That, the narrator suggests, is its own kind of miracle, the miracle of being able to name one's fears without collapsing beneath them. He begins to speak, though his voice is barely above a whisper. He speaks not in polished prayer but in stumbling fragments, a name repeated like a plea, a promise he fears he cannot keep, apologies that burn his throat as he gives them shape. The narrator does not reveal the specifics, his words are his own, but we feel the weight of them through the trembling in his hands. It is the language of someone who has nothing left to hide, and nowhere else to place the contents of a wounded heart. No breeze stirs the candles, no warmth flows from the reliquary. The stone beneath him remains cold and unyielding. But something inside him begins to shift, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gentle letting go. The narrator traces this feeling with care. It is not certainty. It is not the promise of healing. It is the quiet understanding that he has come as far as a human being can go under their own strength. Whether fate bends or stays rigid is no longer the point. He has delivered his plea. His journey has emptied him, and that emptiness makes space for stillness. He lifts his head slowly. The candles around him feel brighter now, though he knows they have not changed. The reliquary glows softly, its surface reflecting a faint shimmer over his tired face. For the first time since the beginning of his journey, he feels seen not necessarily by a saint or a presence, but by the truth of the moment itself. The narrator settles into that idea. Sometimes being witnessed, even silently, is enough to keep someone from breaking. The pilgrim's eyes brim with tears he did not intend to shed, and he lets them fall freely onto the stone. He reaches forward, not daring to touch the reliquary itself, but placing his palm flat against the altar just below it. The wood is warm, where countless hands have rested. He imagines the many stories carried here before his: mothers praying for children, soldiers praying for peace, wanderers begging for forgiveness, all kneeling in the same place, all leaving portions of their fear and hope behind. He does not feel alone. He feels threaded into a long line of people wanting time to soften, wanting fate to shift a few degrees, wanting pain to loosen its grip. After a long silence, he speaks one final phrase, quiet, steady, and clear. The narrator does not repeat the words, but tells us they are both a request and a surrender. A final offering, given without expectation. He lets the air hold the meaning. He knows he cannot force an answer. He knows the road home might crush him just as easily as it might carry him safely. Yet he feels lighter. Not because the future has changed, but because he has met it honestly, without hiding. The act of kneeling here has curved something small inside him toward peace. The narrator begins with a slow withdrawing motion, as if the camera itself is stepping backward from the pilgrim's bowed form. The chapel's warm glow fades into shadow, and then into the dark outside, until the pilgrim becomes a small figure bathed in candlelight at the center of a vast night. His story does not end inside those stone walls, but it pauses there like a breath held between two heartbeats. The narrator allows the air to settle around that pause before turning gently, almost imperceptibly, toward the viewer sitting alone in their quiet room. The image of the pilgrim dissolves into the soft glow of a modern screen. The shift is gradual, not jarring, the light of candles blending with the light of pixels, until one becomes the other. The narrator explains that although centuries separate the viewer from the man on the night road, the emotional architecture binding them together is nearly identical. Both have walked through darkness. Both have carried silent fears. Both have sought places, digital or stone, where the world feels thin enough for change to slip through. The viewer has traveled as far in thought as the pilgrim traveled in miles. The narrator speaks directly now, though the tone remains soothing. "You have been walking with him," the voice says, "through forests, catacombs, ruined chapels, and flickering histories. But the journey is not only his. It is the viewer's too, because every chapter reflected something. Modern hearts recognize the weight of uncertainty, the hunger for meaning, the stubborn belief that life does not have to remain exactly as it is. The viewer's late-night search through videos, through stories, through memories, carries the same pulse of longing that once pushed feet across mud and stone. The camera drifts over a quiet room, a bed unmade, a window reflecting the dim street beyond, a phone resting in someone's hand. The narrator lingers here, reminding the viewer that while no forest hems them in, while no wolves stalk the path behind them, they are still navigating a kind of night road, one made of questions, regrets, hopes, and fragile wishes whispered into the dark. The glow of the screen becomes a lantern, guiding them through a landscape not of trees and shrines, but of thoughts and memories. The narrator reflects on the essence of pilgrimage. It has never been only about relics or miles. It has always been about stepping outside the usual path, about confronting oneself with a mixture of fear and courage. The viewer has done something similar, simply by staying with this story. People do not watch long-form mysteries at night for entertainment alone. They watch because something in them seeks a shift, a gentler future, a softened fate, a moment of clarity to hold on to when the world feels heavy. The viewer is not an observer. They are a participant in the same ancient human act. The narrator gives the emotional spike here, quiet but unmistakable, the realization that the viewer has already performed countless small pilgrimages in their own life. Every time they faced a moment that could have broken them and chose to keep going. Every time they asked for help, even silently. Every time they stood at the threshold of change and pushed the door open despite trembling hands. The pilgrim in the chapel is not a symbol of something distant. He is a mirror tilted gently toward the viewer's own past, reflecting moments of unexpected resilience they may have forgotten. Now, the narrator pulls back further, letting a soft sense of dawn touch the edges of the scene. The pilgrim exits the shrine slowly, stepping into a world where night is thinning and pale light is beginning to gather. His journey is not over. He must still return home, must still face whatever waits for him there, but something inside him has shifted. He walks more steadily than before, carrying the quiet weight of being changed in ways not fully understood. The narrator suggests that this is the nature of such moments. They rearrange the heart long before the mind catches up. In the same breath, the narrator shifts the focus back to the viewer, who will soon close the video or let the audio fade. "You have walked a long road too," the voice murmurs. "Not across countries, but across your own memories." Perhaps they feel a little lighter, or a little more tired, or strangely calmed. Perhaps something in their chest feels less tangled. Perhaps nothing feels different at all. Yet something quiet has been placed inside them, like a small candle left burning after everyone else has gone to sleep. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for morning. The narrator moves into the final reflection. Humans have always tried to bend their stories, not out of arrogance, but out of a fierce, fragile belief that life is worth shaping. Medieval pilgrims risked wolves and storms because they could not accept that pain was final. Modern seekers scroll through strange corners of the night internet for the same reason. We are creatures of hope, even when hope feels foolish. We are creatures of longing, even when the world feels fixed. We walk roads visible and invisible, carrying our private relics of memory and possibility like small flames cupped against the wind. The final image is gentle. The pilgrim walks away from the shrine as dawn breaks. The viewer sits in their dim room, lit only by the fading glow of a screen. Both are quiet, both are tired, both have survived another night. The narrator speaks one last time, voice lowering into a tone made for sleep. When you finally close your eyes, will your world be exactly the same? Or has something quiet already stepped toward you in the dark? The question is not meant to be solved. It is meant to linger, like the faint scent of incense after the candles have gone out.